Long before the first Roman soldier faced a Carthaginian war elephant, the Mediterranean was already shaped by centuries of competing colonies and emerging trade powers. By the beginning of the first millennium BCE, the Mediterranean was transitioning from a fragmented post-Bronze Age environment into an interconnected system of coastal settlements, trade circuits, and expanding colonial networks. The centuries between 1200 and 600 BCE formed the geopolitical foundation upon which both Rome and Carthage would later rise. This period was defined by the collapse of long-established palace-based states, the emergence of successor communities, and the gradual reorganization of maritime commerce. Understanding these developments is essential because the geopolitical structures that shaped the First Punic War had already begun to form half a millennium earlier. The Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE disrupted the Eastern Mediterranean's major powers, including the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and several Levantine city kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Ugarit, Hattusa, and Mycenaean palatial centers indicates widespread destruction layers, population displacements, and the contraction of long-distance trade. Linear B archives ceased, urban centers declined, and monumental architecture largely disappeared for several generations. This disruption altered the balance of power and created space for new maritime actors to occupy the central and western Mediterranean. The vacuum did not create immediate new powers, but it allowed several coastal communities to develop seafaring capabilities without facing the centralized oversight of earlier imperial networks. In the Levant, the Phoenician city-states, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and others, emerged from the collapse with an economic model oriented toward maritime commerce. Their geography, limited agricultural hinterlands, and access to timber from the Lebanon Range incentivized shipbuilding and overseas trade. Inscriptional evidence from Byblos and later Assyrian records suggests that Phoenician mariners rapidly extended their commercial reach throughout the Mediterranean. Their system was decentralized. Each city-state operated independently, establishing trading posts and small colonies designed to service merchant fleets rather than assert territorial control. This flexible structure allowed them to move into regions where earlier Bronze Age powers had not maintained a stable presence. The Phoenician expansion westward began by the late 10th and 9th centuries BCE. Archaeologists have identified early Phoenician levels at sites such as Utica in modern Tunisia, Motia in western Sicily, and Gator, later Cadiz, on the Atlantic coast of Iberia. Ceramic assemblages, especially the presence of Phoenician red slip ware, demonstrate consistent trade links connecting these settlements to the Levant. The establishment of Carthage around the late 9th century BCE is part of this broader pattern. Although traditional literary accounts place the foundation around 814 BCE, the archaeological sequence indicates a slightly later date, with substantial settlement activity emerging by the late 8th century. Regardless of precise chronology, the region around modern Tunis became a hub for Phoenician merchants, forming a strategic midpoint between Tyre and the resource-rich western Mediterranean. While Phoenician seafarers were consolidating their network, the Greek world was undergoing its own transformation. The Greek Dark Age following the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces gradually gave way to population growth, technological adaptations such as the adoption of iron tools, and the formation of early city-states. By the 8th century BCE, Greek communities began establishing overseas colonies driven by demographic pressure, internal political tensions, and the search for arable land. These settlements emerged in southern Italy, Sicily, and the western Mediterranean, creating a parallel expansion to the Phoenician network. One of the earliest and most informative Greek sites is Pithecusae on the island of Ischia. Excavations there have revealed a mixed population engaged in metallurgy, trade, and craft production. The famous Nestor's Cup inscription is among the earliest examples of Greek alphabetic writing and illustrates the spread of literacy along with colonial activity. Pithecusae's role as an intermediary in the trade of metals from Etruria and other parts of Italy demonstrates how Greek settlers integrated themselves into existing economic systems rather than replacing them. As Greek settlements expanded into Sicily and southern Italy, particularly at sites such as Syracuse and Megara Hyblia, they began to overlap with Phoenician influence zones. This overlap would become a central structural factor in later geopolitical rivalries. The Western Mediterranean was not shaped solely by external settlers. Indigenous societies in Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa interacted actively with Greek and Phoenician newcomers. The Nuragic culture of Sardinia, with its distinctive stone towers, engaged in trade with Phoenician merchants, as evidenced by imported ceramics and metal goods. In Sicily, the Sicels, Elymians, and Sicanians developed complex relationships with both Greek and Phoenician groups, sometimes forming alliances and sometimes resisting external pressure. These interactions were fluid and shaped by local resource availability, defensive needs, and the evolving ambitions of foreign colonies. For Carthage in particular, diplomacy with indigenous groups formed a lasting component of its Western strategy. In central Italy, the early Iron Age saw the emergence of the Villanovan culture, characterized by cremation burials and distinct material traditions. This culture would eventually give rise to the Etruscans, who by the 8th century BCE were establishing urban centers, exploiting mineral resources, and participating in Mediterranean trade networks. Etruscan maritime activity, visible in shipwreck evidence and imported goods, shows that they too shaped the commercial environment into which Rome later emerged. Rome itself, during the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, began as one among many Latin communities on the Tiber. At this early stage it was not yet a major power, but its location at a river crossing point ensured integration into regional trade. The exchange of goods such as Bucero pottery and imported Greek ceramics indicates Rome's participation in broader networks long before it acquired political hegemony. The Mediterranean of 1200 to 600 BCE was therefore not a single unified system but a series of overlapping spheres connected by seafaring, trade, and localized political development. What distinguishes this period is the gradual tightening of these connections as states, colonies, and indigenous societies interacted with increasing regularity. Circuits of exchange linked the Levant to Sicily, Iberia to Italy, and North Africa to the Aegean. This growing interdependence shaped the competitive environment that produced both Carthage and Rome as regional powers. Two interpretive insights help explain this evolution. First, the post-Bronze Age shift from palace economies to city-state networks created a more dynamic geopolitical landscape. Instead of a few dominant empires controlling Mediterranean trade, dozens of autonomous communities competed for resources and influence. This decentralization encouraged maritime specialization and fostered the emergence of networks such as the Phoenician diaspora. Second, the rise of colonization, both Greek and Phoenician, created permanent settlements that stabilized trade routes. Colonies acted as logistical bases, anchoring long-distance commerce and enabling states to extend their influence far beyond their home territories. These structural changes made conflict between expanding coastal powers increasingly likely. Archaeological discoveries reinforce this view of interconnected development. The harbor works at Tyre, the fortifications at Motia, the mixed cemeteries of Pithecusae, and the early urban layers of Carthage all illustrate how maritime activity shaped political trajectories. Each region's access to resources, timber in the Levant, metals in Italy and Iberia, fertile plains in parts of North Africa, contributed to distinct development paths. Carthage would later leverage its agricultural hinterland and maritime position, while Rome would exploit the advantages of Italy's river networks and central location. By the late 7th century BCE, the Mediterranean had stabilized into a recognizable geopolitical configuration. Phoenician colonies dominated segments of North Africa, Iberia, and the Western Islands. Greek police controlled much of Sicily and southern Italy. Etruscan states formed a strong presence in central Italy, and Latin communities, Rome among them, were beginning to consolidate. The increasing density of these settlements and their commercial interdependence created conditions in which competition over sea routes, markets, and regional influence became structurally embedded. These long-term developments set the stage for the later confrontation between Rome and Carthage. The strategic logic of their conflict can only be understood within the context of the earlier Mediterranean world, where maritime networks, colonial expansions, and resource-driven rivalries shaped every major power's ambitions. As Phoenician settlements consolidated into a Carthaginian core, events in central Italy produced another rising power. By the 5th century BCE, Rome had developed a political system designed for continual military mobilization. Rome's early development from the 8th to the 5th centuries BCE is documented through a combination of archaeological discoveries, early textual traditions, and comparative patterns visible across central Italy. While the legendary narratives preserved in Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus describe a sequence of kings and foundational laws, the material evidence provides a clearer picture of a gradually emerging urban community. Understanding these early centuries is essential because Rome's institutions, military practices, and social hierarchies were shaped long before its conflicts with Carthage. The political mechanisms that later enabled the Republic to sustain prolonged wars were rooted in the transformations of this formative period. Archaeological excavations in the Forum Romanum demonstrate that by the late 8th century BCE, Rome had transitioned from a cluster of hilltop settlements into a more integrated community. The draining of the marshy basin through the construction of the Cloaca Maxima, traditionally attributed to the reign of Tarquinius Priscus but likely developed over several generations, created a civic center where assemblies and markets could gather. Stratigraphic layers dating to the 7th century BCE show structured leveling, indicating coordinated labor that suggests some form of centralized authority. These developments align with the emergence of early Roman kingship, a system that combined religious, judicial, and military functions. The institution of kingship in Rome was not unique in the Italian context. Etruscan city-states and Latin communities also possessed leaders with sacral and political authority. Roman tradition identifies 7 kings, beginning with Romulus and ending with Tarquinius Superbus. Although these names and associated stories contain mythic elements, several patterns remain historically plausible. The portrayal of early kings as organizers of military forces, builders of defensive walls, and founders of cults reflects the responsibilities expected of leaders in early Iron Age societies. Archaeological finds such as the Regia on the Forum's edge, an early monumental building associated with royal or priestly functions, corroborate the existence of an elite authority structure by the 7th century BCE. During the monarchy, Rome expanded its influence across parts of Latium. Evidence from settlement patterns indicates that smaller communities were gradually incorporated through alliances, marriages, and conquest. The Servian Wall, although traditionally attributed to the 6th king, reflects a broader period of urban fortification during the 6th century BCE. This defensive architecture suggests both external pressures and internal stabilization, characteristics consistent with a growing regional power. Rome's infantry forces also evolved during this period. Textual sources describe a system in which military service was tied to property ownership, a principle consistent with broader Italic practices. This early framework laid the groundwork for the later manipular legions. The transition from monarchy to republic around 509 BCE remains a complex event, combining political reform, elite competition, and changing regional dynamics. Roman tradition describes the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus and the creation of the consulate, a dual magistracy designed to prevent the reemergence of monarchical authority. While specific details are uncertain, the shift is consistent with trends across central Italy, where aristocratic families increasingly challenged hereditary kingship. The early republic replaced single ruler authority with an arrangement in which annual magistrates exercised limited, legally constrained power. The Senate, originally an advisory body under the kings, gained influence during the early republic. Composed primarily of patrician families, it controlled long-term decision-making, foreign policy, and financial matters. The consuls retained military command, known as imperium, but their authority was restricted by collegiality and the one-year term limit. These structural features strengthened Rome's political stability by preventing power from concentrating in a single individual. They also ensured regular rotation of military leadership, which, when combined with the Senate's continuity, created a system capable of consistent strategic planning. The early republic also witnessed the codification of legal principles. The creation of the 12 tables around the mid-5th century BCE was a central development, prompted by social tensions between patricians and plebeians. The plebeian secession of 494 BCE resulted in the establishment of the tribunate, an office designed to protect the interests of non-elite citizens. The 12 tables standardized legal procedures and property rights, reducing the aristocracy's ability to manipulate unwritten customs. This transition illustrates how Rome's political evolution was shaped not only by elite competition but also by pressure from broader social groups. These reforms contributed to the development of a more inclusive, though still aristocracy-dominated, political order. Military organization continued to change as the Republic consolidated. According to Roman tradition, Servius Tullius had earlier introduced a census-based system that assigned military obligations according to property classes. In practice, this produced an army structured around citizen soldiers who supplied their own equipment. Archaeological evidence of standardized weapon types in central Italy supports the existence of relatively coherent infantry formations. By the 5th century BCE, this model allowed Rome to mobilize large numbers of men compared to neighboring communities. The annual election of consuls ensured that military leadership was continually refreshed, while the Senate maintained strategic consistency across years and campaigns. An important analytical insight is that the Republic's political system and its military obligations reinforced one another. Because military service was tied to citizenship and land ownership, political participation was linked to involvement in warfare. The system incentivized Rome's expansion across Latium, as newly acquired land could be distributed to citizens, increasing the pool of men eligible for service. Records from the period describe repeated conflicts with neighboring groups, including the Volsci, Equi, and Etruscans. Although textual descriptions often contain legendary embellishment, the overall pattern of constant warfare is consistent with the archaeological destruction layers and settlement shifts observed throughout central Italy. Land distribution and colonization became tools for consolidating Roman control. When Rome defeated an opponent part of the conquered territory, ager publicus was retained by the state. Some land was leased and some was allocated to settlers or veterans. Over time, this system reinforced Rome's capacity to mobilize manpower. The structural link between territorial expansion, citizen landholding, and military recruitment would later prove essential in the prolonged conflicts with Carthage, where sustained mobilization was a decisive factor. The patrician-plebeian conflict continued to shape early Republican development. Although the upper classes maintained control over the key magistracies, plebeians gradually gained political representation. The creation of the concilium plebis and the election of plebeian tribunes provided institutional mechanisms for challenging aristocratic dominance. The long-term effect was the gradual integration of a wider social base into Roman political life. This inclusiveness, limited though it was, allowed the Republic to maintain internal cohesion during extended periods of warfare. Rome's early diplomatic and military interactions with Etruscan and Latin neighbors illustrate another systemic feature: the Republic's capacity for forming alliances. The Latin League, although fluctuating in membership and influence, bound Roman interests to other communities in Latium. Treaties such as the Foedus Cassianum demonstrate the Republic's ability to formalize cooperative arrangements. These alliances expanded Rome's military capacity, enabling coordinated campaigns that further strengthened its regional position. Archaeological remains from early temples and public spaces indicate that religious institutions also played a role in political cohesion. The establishment of state cults and priestly colleges created shared civic identities. The integration of Etruscan architectural and cultural elements, visible in temple foundations such as the early phases of the Capitoline Temple, shows how Rome adapted external influences into its developing political culture. These institutions helped legitimize the authority of magistrates and reinforced the distinction between civic and foreign enemies. By the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE, Rome had consolidated its political structures around a system that balanced elite control with broader participation. Annual magistracies, senatorial oversight, and a legally defined citizen body created a resilient political order. The military obligations tied to property, combined with land distribution and expansionist policies, produced a society capable of sustaining repeated campaigns. This combination explains Rome's unusual capacity for endurance in conflict, a characteristic that would later define its rivalry with Carthage. As Rome expanded through Italy, Carthage was simultaneously becoming the dominant naval power in the western Mediterranean. By the 4th century BCE, Carthage commanded the most extensive maritime network in the western Mediterranean. The rise of Carthage from a Phoenician outpost to a dominant maritime power was a gradual process shaped by geography, trade networks, naval technology, and its expanding North African hinterland. Although ancient literary traditions preserve a founding date of 814 BCE, these accounts, especially those attributed to Timaeus, reflect later historical memory rather than contemporary documentation. Archaeological discoveries, however, confirm that by the late 9th and early 8th centuries BCE, Phoenician merchants had begun establishing permanent settlements along the North African coast. Carthage emerged among these sites as the most strategically positioned, located on a peninsula offering natural harbors and access to both east, west, and north-south maritime routes. Early Phoenician colonies such as Utica, Mocha, and Gades illustrate the broader framework of Levantine expansion. These settlements functioned as trading stations linking the Mediterranean with Atlantic tin routes and Iberian mineral resources. Carthage's early development mirrored this pattern but soon diverged due to its exceptional location. The Bursa Hill provided defensible high ground, while the surrounding lagoon systems created sheltered anchorage. These geographic features, confirmed through geomorphological studies of the Gulf of Tunis, explain why Carthage quickly assumed a central role in regional commerce. Material remains from early strata at Carthage show typical Phoenician cultural markers: red slip pottery, imported amphorae containing wine and oil, and religious installations associated with Baal Hammon and Tanit. Among the most debated archaeological features are the Tophets, open-air precincts containing urns with cremated remains of infants and animals. Scholars differ on their interpretation. Some view them as evidence of child sacrifice based on classical accounts, while others argue they reflect a specialized infant cemetery. Regardless of interpretation, the Tophets demonstrate that religious practices played an important role in the city's identity from its earliest phases. By the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, the decline of Tyre and increasing pressure from Assyrian expansion reduced the direct oversight of Western Phoenician colonies. This shift allowed Carthage to assume a leading position within a loose confederation of Punic settlements. According to classical authors such as Diodorus and Justin, Carthage began coordinating military responses to threats against Phoenician communities in Sicily and Sardinia. Although these narratives contain retrospective embellishments, archaeological finds of Punic fortifications and standardized material culture across these islands support the idea of increasing Carthaginian influence. Carthage's economic base grew steadily through its integration of regional trade networks. Excavated shipwrecks containing Punic amphorae, such as those found off the coast of Majorca and southern France, illustrate the city's wide commercial reach. These amphorae carried goods including wine, olives, salted fish, and luxury items. The scale and uniformity of these containers indicate an organized economic system capable of high-volume maritime distribution. Carthage's shipbuilding capabilities further reinforced its influence. Classical sources describe the city's expertise in naval architecture and underwater remains of Punic ships, particularly those discovered near Marsala, confirm the existence of sturdy, fast war galleys modeled on Eastern prototypes. Agriculture in Carthage's North African hinterland formed another pillar of its economy. The region's fertile soils and predictable climate supported grain, olives, figs, and vines. Later Roman sources, especially the writings attributed to Mago the Carthaginian, whose agricultural handbook was translated into Latin after Carthage's destruction, attest to advanced farming techniques. Terracing, irrigation channels, and crop rotation are all documented practices. Archaeologists working in the Tunisian countryside have identified ancient farm complexes that align with descriptions of Carthaginian rural estates. These facilities produced surpluses that supported the city's population and fed military expeditions. Carthage's political organization reflected a blend of Phoenician traditions and local adaptations. The city was governed by Sephites, dual magistrates whose office resembled judges more than kings. Their authority was balanced by a council of elders, which represented powerful families, and by the Council of 104, a supervisory body responsible for monitoring military commanders. Aristotle's later analysis of the Carthaginian constitution highlights its relative stability and its mixture of oligarchic and democratic elements. The awarding of military commands often depended on merit and wealth rather than hereditary status, indicating a system capable of promoting effective leadership. This institutional structure contributed to Carthage's ability to coordinate large-scale military and economic operations without centralized monarchical power. An important interpretive insight is that Carthage's political system was designed to manage a far-reaching economic network rather than a territorial empire in the traditional sense. Unlike Rome, whose early expansion relied on land-based conquest, Carthage's strength lay in maritime control, trade agreements, and the protection of commercial routes. This distinction shaped the city's diplomacy and military strategy. Treaties with Etruscan cities and Greek colonies, preserved in part by later authors, reveal that Carthage frequently negotiated access to ports and resources rather than pursuing annexation. The city's reliance on mercenary forces became another defining feature. Rather than relying solely on citizen soldiers, Carthage recruited troops from across North Africa, Iberia, Sicily, and the Mediterranean islands. Libyans, Numidians, Iberians, Balearic slingers, and Greek hoplites formed the core of its armies. This recruitment strategy allowed Carthage to project power across distant theaters without depleting its own citizen population. However, it also introduced long-term vulnerabilities, as loyalty depended on pay and effective leadership. Greek sources comment frequently on the diverse composition of Carthaginian armies, but archaeological evidence, such as Iberian-style weapons found near North African sites, supports these descriptions. Carthage's expanding interests in Iberia illustrate the strategic interaction between economic resources and military operations. Silver mines in southeastern Spain, particularly those near the Guadalquivir, provided a crucial revenue stream. While these mines became most prominent during the Barcid period in the 3rd century BCE, earlier commercial contacts laid the foundation for later territorial expansion. Phoenician and Punic settlements along the Spanish coast, including modern-day Cadiz, Malacca, and Ibiza, served as supply and trade stations. Shipwrecks found off the Iberian coast containing Punic ceramics confirm sustained economic activity in the region long before direct Carthaginian rule. In Sicily, Carthage confronted Greek city-states beginning in the 6th century BCE. These conflicts were driven not only by political rivalry but also by control of trade routes and resources. Archaeologists at sites like Motia and Panormus have identified layers of destruction and rebuilding consistent with repeated military engagements. Motia's extensive fortifications, including its causeway and defensive walls, demonstrate the city's strategic importance within the Carthaginian sphere. Carthage's involvement in Sicily further illustrates how its economic priorities inevitably intersected with military obligations, requiring sustained naval presence and political intervention. Carthage's North African hinterland also developed into a structured administrative zone. Although direct evidence for early provincial organization is limited, classical writers describe different groups: Libyans, Libyo-Phoenicians, and Numidians, each contributing taxes or military auxiliaries. Punic inscriptions from North Africa reveal administrative roles related to taxation, temple oversight, and commercial regulation. These inscriptions, although fragmentary, indicate that Carthage maintained both civic and rural administrative mechanisms. The agricultural productivity of the hinterland supported urban growth, naval construction, and overseas campaigns. Religion played a significant role in Carthaginian society, shaping both civic identity and political legitimacy. Sanctuaries dedicated to Baal Hammon, Tanit, Melkart, and Eshmun have been excavated across the Punic world. The remains of votive dedications, pottery offerings, and ritual installations demonstrate religious continuity with the Levant, while also showing local adaptations. Inscriptions invoking divine protection for merchants and ships reflect the close ties between religion and maritime activity. Religious festivals likely reinforced civic unity and elite authority, although detailed descriptions do not survive. By the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Carthage had developed a sophisticated naval infrastructure. Literary sources describe extensive shipyards and the famous Kathan, an artificial harbor with separate commercial and military basins, illustrates advanced engineering capabilities. Although the monumental harbor structures visible today date primarily to later periods, earlier phases have been identified through underwater and geomorphological surveys. The circular military harbor, with its central island and ship sheds, would eventually allow Carthage to maintain a large fleet ready for rapid deployment. The city's commercial dominance fostered a network of alliances and dependencies across the western Mediterranean. Carthage controlled or influenced territory in North Africa, parts of Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearic Islands, and sections of southern Iberia. Its economic model combined direct exploitation, such as mining and agriculture, with protected trade routes and reciprocal agreements. This system produced considerable wealth, visible in imported luxury goods found at Carthaginian sites and in the urban development of the city itself. A second key interpretive insight is that Carthage's maritime empire created a different type of power projection than Rome's land-based system. Carthage depended on controlling sea lanes and strategic islands, while Rome built alliances and colonies on the Italian mainland. The two systems, maritime oligarchy and land-based republic, were structurally distinct, yet increasingly intersected as both expanded into overlapping spheres of influence. By the early 4th century BCE, Carthage stood as the preeminent naval and commercial power in the western Mediterranean. Its political institutions, economic systems, and military capabilities allowed it to maintain influence across vast distances. However, this expansion inevitably brought the city into contact, and ultimately conflict, with another rising power from the central Mediterranean. With both powers expanding into overlapping spheres of influence, a confrontation became increasingly likely. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome controlled the most extensive land-based manpower system in the western Mediterranean. Rome's consolidation of the Italian peninsula between the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE formed the structural core of its later military dominance. This process began in earnest after the Latin War of 340 to 338 BCE, when Rome reorganized its relationships with the Latin communities. Instead of dissolving local autonomy completely, Roman authorities established a graduated hierarchy of obligations. Some Latin communities received partial citizenship with limited voting rights. Others became socii, bound by bilateral treaties, foedera, that required the provision of troops in wartime. Archaeological layers at sites such as Tibur and Praeneste show construction consistent with Roman oversight, indicating a shift toward integrated regional administration rather than outright annexation. The Latin settlement system became Rome's first durable framework for scaling its military capacity. Rome's expansion accelerated during the three Samnite Wars, 343 to 290 BCE, which exposed the limits of Rome's early hoplite-style formations. The rugged Apennine terrain favored flexible, mobile fighting units, and Roman forces gradually adopted the manipular system. Polybius notes that by the mid-4th century BCE, maniples, small tactical blocks of 120 soldiers, began replacing dense phalanxes, allowing Rome to maneuver effectively against Samnite hill fighters. Excavations at Bovianum Vetus and Cipinum reveal fortifications and weapon deposits consistent with prolonged campaigns, confirming the war's intensity and the adaptability of Roman tactical doctrine. This transition represented one of the most important structural innovations of the Republican military. It enabled Rome to mobilize large forces while maintaining tactical resilience across varied landscapes. The Second Samnite War, 326 to 304 BCE, also marked the beginning of Rome's large-scale colonization program. Roman coloni, such as those established at Callus, 334 BCE, and Frigeli, 328 BCE, acted as secure garrisons and agricultural centers. Archaeologists have identified standardized street layouts, defensive walls, and pottery assemblages, demonstrating mixed populations of Roman settlers and local Italians. These colonies were not mere outposts. They were instruments of demographic and strategic integration. Their placement along key river valleys and coastal routes ensured continuous Roman presence, enabling rapid mobilization during subsequent conflicts. Rome's military adaptation and settlement strategies created a durable logistical network, but diplomacy played an equally significant role. The diverse Italian communities, Etruscans, Sabines, Umbrians, and Lucanians, did not become Roman allies through a single decisive campaign. Instead, Rome negotiated treaties that balanced coercion with incentives. Etruscan cities, weakened by internal divisions and declining maritime power, increasingly accepted Roman arbitration. Evidence from Tarquinii and Volsinii indicates civic restructuring in the late 4th century BCE, likely influenced by Roman political models. The gradual incorporation of these communities expanded Rome's recruitment base and strengthened its agricultural resources. Rome's confrontation with the Greek cities of southern Italy further consolidated its regional position. The conflict with Tarentum and the ensuing war with Pyrrhus of Epirus, 280 to 275 BCE, tested Rome's system of alliances more severely than any earlier conflict. Pyrrhus introduced Hellenistic military techniques, war elephants, sarissa-wielding phalanxes, and coordinated cavalry charges, demonstrating the tactical sophistication of Eastern Mediterranean warfare. Ancient authors such as Plutarch record that Pyrrhus's early victories, including those at Heraclea, 280 BCE, and Asculum, 279 BCE, inflicted considerable Roman losses, yet Rome's allied structure prevented collapse. Municipal inscriptions and dedicatory offerings from central Italy show continued civic participation in the war, illustrating a political culture committed to sustained mobilization despite battlefield setbacks. The Roman capacity to absorb losses reflected more than manpower alone. The Senate coordinated long-term resource allocation, ensuring that armies replaced casualties rapidly. Archaeological surveys across Latium and Campania indicate intensified agricultural production in the early 3rd century BCE, suggesting that rural estates supported large-scale military provisioning. The construction of the Via Appia beginning in 312 BCE, documented by both literary sources and surviving road segments, further enhanced logistical efficiency. This road connected Rome to Capua, enabling rapid troop movements during operations in southern Italy. Rome's ability to coordinate infrastructure, agriculture, and military deployment showcased an integrated system unmatched in the Western Mediterranean. Pyrrhus's withdrawal from Italy in 275 BCE marked a turning point. His inability to sever Rome's alliance network demonstrated that the Republic's strength lay not in individual battles but in institutional durability. By this time, Rome had incorporated vast populations into its military system. Estimates based on Polybius's histories suggest that, by the mid-3rd century BCE, Rome and its Italian allies could mobilize over 500,000 men if necessary. This figure, supported by demographic modeling and settlement archaeology, illustrates a reserve capacity far greater than that of any single Mediterranean power. The aftermath of the Punic War solidified Rome's dominance. Greek polis such as Neapolis and Rhegium formalized their positions as Roman allies, while others accepted direct oversight. The integration of southern Italy brought new ports, skilled sailors, and access to maritime routes that had previously been dominated by Greek and Punic traders. This shift did not immediately transform Rome into a naval power, but it provided the geographic foundations for its later maritime expansion during the First Punic War. By 275 BCE, Rome controlled a unified territorial bloc stretching from the Po Valley frontier to the Straits of Messina. The combination of land-based military organization, allied manpower, colony, and expanding administrative oversight created a structured political system capable of sustained warfare. These developments explain why Rome, despite lacking a naval tradition at this stage, would be able to challenge Carthage, a city whose power rested on maritime networks, in the decades ahead. With Rome dominant on land, Carthage remained the central naval power, a division that defined the balance of power in the Western Mediterranean. Carthage's wealth and power rested on a network of Mediterranean territories, whose resources fueled its military system. Carthaginian expansion into Sicily, Sardinia, and Iberia between the 6th and 3rd centuries BCE formed the economic and strategic foundation of Punic power. These regions not only supplied Carthage with agricultural goods, metals, and trade routes, but also created the logistical base from which it sustained its mercenary armies. Archaeological evidence, including Punic fortifications, coinage, ceramics, and inscriptions, illustrates the degree of administrative involvement the Carthaginians exercised across the western Mediterranean. Understanding this territorial network is essential for explaining why competition with Rome over Sicily eventually escalated into a major interstate conflict. Carthage's presence in western Sicily emerged from earlier Phoenician coastal settlements at Motia, Panormus, and Saguntum. By the 6th century BCE, these sites had developed into fortified urban centers with distinct Punic architectural forms, rectangular bastions, casemate walls, and standardized storage facilities. Excavations at Motia have revealed extensive industrial zones and religious structures, including the Capodazou Sanctuary, reflecting a mature urban economy tightly linked to Carthaginian interests. As Greek colonization spread across eastern and southern Sicily, Carthage began adopting a more assertive defensive posture. The confrontation between Punic and Greek spheres of influence culminated in the series of Sicilian wars against Syracuse from the late 6th to 4th centuries BCE. Carthaginian strategy in Sicily focused on maintaining a buffer of loyal or neutral cities. Classical sources note alliances with Segesta and Eryx, both of which relied on Punic support against Greek rivals. These alliances, preserved in bilingual inscriptions and coinage, demonstrate Carthage's reliance on indirect control rather than full territorial annexation. However, periods of war with Syracuse, particularly under the generals Hamilco and Hamilcar in the early 4th century BCE, saw increased direct military intervention. According to Diodorus Siculus, Carthage deployed large mercenary forces composed of Libyans, Iberians, Campanians, and Numidians. This reliance on mercenaries required steady access to external resources, one reason Carthage's wider territorial network became indispensable. Syracuse remained the chief opponent to Punic influence. The city's control of central and eastern Sicily prevented Carthage from dominating the island's agricultural hinterlands and key ports. Archaeological strata at Syracuse's Epipoli Plateau show continuous fortification enhancements during this period, suggesting a prolonged defensive posture against Punic armies. Sporadic Carthaginian victories, such as the capture of Acragas in 406 BCE, temporarily shifted the island's balance of power. Yet Greek resilience prevented a decisive Punic takeover. By the 3rd century BCE, western Sicily remained Carthage's primary stronghold, but the island as a whole remained contested, an unstable equilibrium that set the stage for future conflict with Rome. Carthaginian control over Sardinia and Corsica developed along different lines. Phoenician traders had frequented the islands for centuries, but Carthaginian influence intensified in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. Settlements such as Theros, Nora, and Sulci display clear Punic cultural imprints. Bilingual inscriptions, tofits, and standardized pottery assemblages. The island's agricultural and mineral resources made them economically valuable. Sardinia's interior produced grain and livestock, while the southwestern region contained metal deposits exploited through Carthaginian administrative oversight. Archaeologists have identified Punic rural estates, storage pits, and irrigation systems indicative of planned agricultural expansion. Yet, unlike Sicily, Sardinia's interior population resisted external control. Classical accounts describe cycles of conflict between Punic settlements and indigenous Nuragic communities. Evidence of fortified Punic outposts near the island's interior suggests that Carthage faced persistent resistance and therefore maintained only partial territorial control. Despite this, the coastal regions remained sufficiently stable to support long-distance trade. Punic coinage minted in Sardinia during the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE illustrates the integration of the island into Carthage's financial system and indicates the presence of monetary administration closely tied to military funding. Corsica played a smaller but still significant role. Its timber resources supported Carthaginian shipbuilding, and Punic material culture appears at sites such as Eulalia. While Carthage exercised looser control over Corsica than over Sardinia, the island's strategic position along maritime routes to northern Italy and southern Gaul enhanced Carthaginian naval reach. Combined, the two islands allowed Carthage to maintain a continuous chain of supply stations across the western Mediterranean. Iberia represented Carthage's most resource-rich frontier. Phoenician coastal settlements, Gader, Malacca, Abdera, and others, provided Carthage with access to the region's metal wealth. By the 5th century BCE, Punic administrators had established permanent trading posts and extraction sites in Andalusia. Archaeological excavations at Huelva, the Rio Tinto mining district, and Carthaginian industrial facilities near Cádiz show large-scale silver production. Classical estimates, including those preserved by Polybius, describe Iberian mines capable of producing vast quantities of silver, an output that significantly supplemented Carthage's treasury. This wealth was essential for hiring mercenaries, a cornerstone of the Carthaginian military system. Unlike Rome's citizen army model, Carthage relied heavily on foreign troops, necessitating continuous financial reserves. Iberian silver, North African grain, and Sicilian trade revenues collectively supported this structure. The combination of these resources enabled Carthage to project power far beyond the immediate region of North Africa. Carthaginian presence in Iberia before the First Punic War remained primarily economic rather than territorial. However, contacts with local Iberian communities created the foundation for deeper involvement later in the 3rd century BCE. Material culture from this period shows patterns of hybridization, Punic amphory, Iberian ceramics, and mixed burial customs, indicating steadily increasing interaction. These early networks would become decisive following Carthage's defeat in the First Punic War, when the Barcid family transformed Iberia into a new Punic power base. By the mid-3rd century BCE, Carthage possessed a vast but uneven territorial network, direct control in parts of Sicily and Sardinia, maritime influence in Corsica, and economic penetration into Iberia. These regions not only sustained Carthage's economy, but also shaped its military priorities. The need to defend Sicily from Greek and later Roman aggression forced Carthage into repeated conflicts that strained its resources and challenged its mercenary-based system. Within this competitive environment, Sicily became the inevitable flashpoint for direct confrontation. In 264 BCE, a local dispute in Messana escalated into a confrontation between the Mediterranean's two rising powers. Sicily's position in the central Mediterranean made it the most strategically significant island of the pre-Roman world. Lying between the Italian peninsula and North Africa, and within close reach of Sardinia, Greece, and the Tyrrhenian Sea, the island functioned as a maritime crossroads for commercial and military traffic. By the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, its fertile plains, fortified cities, and multi-ethnic population transformed Sicily into a competitive arena among Greek, indigenous, and Punic actors. This environment produced a complex political landscape where minor disputes frequently drew in larger powers. Understanding why the conflict at Messana in 264 BCE became the tipping point requires examining the island's internal dynamics and the long-standing rivalry between Syracuse and Carthage. Greek influence dominated eastern and southern Sicily, centered on Syracuse. Under Agathocles, 317 to 289 BCE, Syracuse briefly expanded its authority across the island and even threatened Africa during his expedition in the late 4th century BCE. Archaeological layers in Syracuse's fortifications indicate significant military investment during his rule, reflecting the city's ambitions to challenge Carthaginian influence in western Sicily. While Agathocles' death ended these expansionist efforts, Syracuse remained the strongest independent Greek power on the island. His successor, Hieron II, established a more stable political order. According to inscriptions and coinage from Syracuse, Hieron pursued a policy of consolidation rather than expansion, maintaining a cautious balance between defensive concerns and diplomatic engagement. Western Sicily, by contrast, contained long-established Punic settlements. Carthaginian centers at Panormus, Saguntum, and Lilybaeum formed the core of Punic power on the island. Excavations at Lilybaeum have uncovered advanced fortification systems and harbor installations, illustrating Carthage's intent to maintain a permanent military foothold. The frontier between Greek and Punic spheres remained contested, with neither side achieving decisive control. This equilibrium made Sicily particularly sensitive to disruptions by smaller groups operating independently of major state authority. One such group consisted of the Mamertines, Campanian mercenaries originally hired by Agathocles. After his death, they seized the city of Messana, expelling or killing local inhabitants and establishing a military regime. Polybius describes their activities as predatory, relying on raids into surrounding territories, including Syracusan lands. Their control of Messana gave them a commanding position over the Strait of Messina, a narrow passage crucial for communication between Italy and Sicily. The Mamertines lacked the resources to maintain long-term independence, and their aggressive behavior soon provoked Syracuse under Hieron II. By the early 260s BCE, Hieron's successful campaigns placed the Mamertines under increasing pressure. Facing likely defeat, the Mamertines sought external assistance. They first appealed to Carthage, which, seeking to maintain influence in the strait, dispatched a garrison to Messana. This move aligned with Carthaginian interests. Control of Messana could prevent Roman expansion into Sicily and secure a key choke point in central Mediterranean shipping lanes. Archaeological finds of Punic amphorae and military equipment in the region demonstrate Carthage's established logistical presence along northern Sicily prior to these events. The Mamertines soon reconsidered their alliance, fearing Carthaginian dominance. They appealed again, this time to Rome. The request forced the Roman Senate to confront a decision with significant strategic implications. While the Mamertines' seizure of Messana had been unlawful, Roman leaders recognized the geopolitical danger presented by a permanent Carthaginian garrison at the strait. Polybius records debates among Roman magistrates reflecting concerns that Carthage, already entrenched in Sardinia, western Sicily, and North Africa, could encircle the Italian peninsula. Allowing Carthage to dominate Messana might facilitate future naval operations against southern Italy. The Senate's decision was cautious. According to surviving accounts, senators were reluctant to support the Mamertines directly but feared the long-term consequences of inaction. When the matter was brought before the popular assembly, the vote favored intervention. This outcome reflected broader Roman priorities: securing Italian interests, maintaining access to maritime routes, and preventing rival powers from gaining strategic footholds near Roman territory. Rome's entry into Sicily was unprecedented. Until this point, Roman expansion had been confined to the Italian mainland. Crossing into Sicily marked the Republic's first major overseas commitment. The initial Roman force dispatched to Messana consisted of a small contingent led by the consul Appius Claudius Caudex. Upon arrival, Roman commanders persuaded or compelled the Carthaginian garrison to withdraw, triggering immediate escalation. Carthage, viewing the Roman entry as a violation of its protective sphere, responded by mobilizing forces in western Sicily and strengthening alliances with pro-Punic cities. The involvement of Syracuse further complicated the situation. Hieron II, who had been campaigning against the Mamertines, perceived Roman intervention as a threat but also understood the risks of direct confrontation. Early military exchanges demonstrated Rome's determination to maintain its position at Messana, while Carthage prepared for a prolonged conflict. Archaeological evidence from early 3rd century BCE military sites near Messina suggests rapid fortification activity consistent with the sudden arrival of large-scale armies. The dispute, initially local and limited, now became structurally unavoidable. The presence of Roman and Carthaginian forces on opposite sides of the strait set the stage for a protracted struggle. Both states mobilized according to their respective military systems. Rome drawing on its Italian manpower reserves and manipular legions, Carthage relying on existing Sicilian bases and a diverse mercenary force. The island's geography ensured that neither side could easily force a decisive outcome without controlling key ports, fortresses, and supply routes. By the end of 264 BCE, the conflict had shifted from a localized crisis involving mercenaries to a full-scale interstate confrontation. Messana's strategic position made it the opening catalyst in a broader contest over Sicily's political future. Rome and Carthage now faced each other directly, with neither prepared to concede control of the island. With Sicily igniting the conflict, the First Punic War began, a prolonged struggle defined by unprecedented naval innovation. In the opening phase of the First Punic War, Rome crossed a critical threshold. The campaigns between 264 and 260 BCE revealed whether a land-based Italian republic could operate effectively on foreign soil, and whether Carthage, the veteran naval empire of the Western Mediterranean, could maintain its long-established influence over Sicily. The conflict began around Messana, where Rome's decision to intervene on behalf of the Mamertines challenged both Carthaginian authority and Syracusan ambitions. The initial confrontations set the tone for a protracted struggle defined by shifting alliances, intense siege warfare, and a new Roman willingness to commit vast resources far from the Italian mainland. The early battles around Messana demonstrated how quickly local tensions escalated. As Roman forces moved to secure the straits, they faced not only Carthaginian detachments but the army of Syracuse under King Hieron II, a seasoned regional power with its own strategic interests. Yet Rome acted with unexpected diplomatic agility. After brief engagements, Hieron assessed the shifting balance and negotiated a treaty with Rome, transforming Syracuse from a potential threat into a crucial ally. This agreement stabilized the eastern part of the island and allowed Rome to focus its efforts on dismantling Carthaginian strongholds in the west. With Syracuse neutralized, Rome began the painstaking process of securing fortified cities across the central plateau and western coastline. The siege of Agrigentum in 262 BCE stands out as the first major test of Roman resolve outside Italy. Agrigentum was not merely a Carthaginian garrison but a symbol of their enduring presence in Sicily. Roman commanders employed siege ramps, encirclement tactics, and drawn-out attrition warfare, while Carthaginian defenders relied heavily on experienced mercenaries, Iberian infantry, Libyan spearmen, and Greek specialists in missile warfare. Archaeological evidence, including remnants of projectiles and the outlines of Roman entrenchments, offers a tangible sense of the prolonged and brutal nature of this confrontation. The eventual Roman victory at Agrigentum was strategically decisive. It forced Carthage to reconsider its defensive posture on the island and signaled that Rome was willing to invest manpower, time, and logistical resources in a campaign far beyond anything it had attempted before. Polybius emphasizes that the Romans learned quickly. They adapted to Sicilian terrain, improved their supply networks, and sustained operations across seasons despite diseases, attrition, and the complexities of campaigning in an unfamiliar environment. Other fortified centers, Henna, Midistraton, and the network of strongholds controlling inland routes, became targets in the years that followed. Each siege required careful coordination, engineering, and a growing familiarity with Carthaginian defensive methods. Rome's persistence contrasted sharply with Carthage's reliance on mercenary forces and selective commitments of troops. Where Rome could draw on citizen levies and allies across the Italian peninsula, Carthage managed a diverse but often overstretched coalition of hired soldiers whose loyalty was anchored in pay rather than national interest. Despite these successes, the early Sicilian campaign highlighted a fundamental problem. Control of the island could not be secured without command of the sea. Carthage's fleet still dominated the waters surrounding Sicily, interrupting Roman supply lines, rescuing besieged garrisons, and launching counterattacks with speed and flexibility. Even victorious land campaigns were constrained by Rome's inability to challenge Carthaginian naval mobility. The situation became increasingly clear as Roman armies advanced. Without a fleet, every success in Sicily was temporary, vulnerable to sudden Carthaginian intervention. These first engagements, therefore, were more than isolated battles. They were the proving ground for Rome's transformation from a regional land power to an emerging Mediterranean force. The experiences gained in Sicily, from handling unfamiliar siege technologies to negotiating complex alliances, prepared Rome for the next phase of the conflict. And as the Romans recognized the structural advantages enjoyed by Carthage at sea, a monumental decision took shape in the Senate. To continue the war, Rome would have to build a navy from scratch. With Sicilian operations intensifying and Carthaginian sea power remaining unchallenged, Rome understood that control of the war's outcome would depend on a domain in which it had no prior experience. The open waters of the Mediterranean. Rome's decision to build a fleet was nothing short of revolutionary. For centuries, the Republic had defined itself as a land power, its military identity rooted in legions, infantry discipline, and the defensive traditions of the Italian peninsula. But the unfolding Sicilian campaign revealed a hard truth. Without command of the sea, Rome could not decisively break Carthaginian power. What followed was one of the most remarkable military transformations in antiquity, an ambitious naval program that pushed Rome into a domain it had barely touched before. According to Polybius, the catalyst was the capture of a Carthaginian quinquereme that had run aground early in the war. This single ship became the blueprint for an entire fleet. Roman shipwrights, accustomed to building merchant vessels and coastal transports, now studied the unfamiliar proportions of a fully armed warship. Its length, the arrangement of rowing benches, the spacing between oarlocks, and the precise distribution of weight along the hull. Reverse engineering the vessel required not only technical improvisation but a massive expansion of labor and raw materials. Timber from central Italy, bronze for ramming prows, iron for nails and fittings, tar, ropes, and sailcloth all had to be mobilized on an unprecedented scale. The Republic's ability to mobilize manpower again proved decisive. Shipyards sprang up along the western coast, at Ostia, Antium, and other ports, where thousands of craftsmen, laborers, and newly recruited rowers worked continuously. Polybius emphasizes the sheer speed of the construction effort. In mere months, Rome produced a fleet of over 100 quinqueremes, matching, at least numerically, the great naval power of Carthage. This accomplishment was not the result of inherited maritime expertise but of organizational capacity and political will. The consuls and Senate coordinated logistics, requisitioned materials, and oversaw training systems that Rome had never attempted before. Training the crews was an even greater challenge. Most Roman rowers had never served on a warship, and the coordination required to maneuver a quinquereme was exacting. To prepare the men before the ships were even seaworthy, Roman commanders employed an innovative method. They arranged wooden benches on land, simulating the positions of rowers inside a hull. Crews practiced the rhythm of rowing, the commands, the synchronization of oars, and the rapid changes of tempo necessary for ramming maneuvers. Only after this land rehearsal did they move onto the water, where they faced the realities of waves, wind, and the strain of coordinated effort. Modern maritime studies confirm the difficulty of these skills. Even trained oarsmen require long practice to keep five-tiered rows functioning in unison. But Rome's most distinctive contribution to naval warfare was the invention of the corvus, a boarding device that replaced naval seamanship with infantry supremacy. Atop the prow of each quinquereme stood a wooden tower supporting a long, pivoting gangplank equipped with a heavy iron spike. Once an enemy ship came within range, the corvus would be dropped, the spike biting into the opposing deck and binding the two vessels together. This turned naval battles into floating infantry engagements, and here Rome excelled. Legionaries surged across the boarding bridge, converting maritime encounters into the kind of close combat they had mastered on land. While the device made ships dangerously top-heavy, it neutralized the maneuvering advantage on which Carthaginian crews relied. The first major test of the new fleet came in 260 BCE at the Battle of Mylae. The Carthaginian commander, Hannibal Gisco, expected an easy victory over inexperienced Roman crews. His ships were faster, his rowers better drilled, and his sailors accustomed to complex maneuvers such as the deeplis and periplus, tactics that allowed Carthaginian vessels to ram opponents from vulnerable angles. But the corvus transformed the engagement. When the Carthaginian vanguard attempted to circle and strike, Roman consular commander Gaius Duilius ordered his crews to hold formation. As enemy ships closed in, the Roman vessels did not attempt to outmaneuver them, they simply locked onto them. One after another, Carthaginian ships were boarded, overwhelmed by infantry, and captured. The psychological impact of Mylae was enormous. Rome had defeated Carthage at sea, something previously thought impossible. Duilius received the unprecedented honor of a victory column decorated with the bronze rams of captured warships. Polybius reports that the battle validated Rome's strategic shift. By substituting discipline and engineering for naval finesse, they had created a new model of maritime warfare. Nevertheless, challenges remained. The corvus made Roman ships unwieldy and vulnerable to storms. The rapid construction of the fleet meant that many hulls were poorly seasoned or imperfectly assembled. Supply chains for replacement parts, spare oars, and rigging had to be developed on the fly. And while the infantry-centered approach worked brilliantly in early battles, Carthaginian commanders soon learned to avoid direct confrontations where the corvus could be deployed. As the war progressed, Rome would need to master traditional naval tactics as well, a process that unfolded only gradually. Even with these limitations, the naval revolution marked a turning point in the First Punic War. Rome had transformed itself from a regional land power into a maritime force capable of contesting Carthage's ancient supremacy. The speed, determination, and adaptability that defined the construction of the fleet became hallmarks of Roman strategy in the decades to come. For the first time, Carthage faced an enemy able to meet it on equal terms, not just on land, but across the open sea that had long been the heart of its power. With its fleet operational and its confidence renewed, Rome pressed forward into more ambitious operations. The next phase of the war would see naval campaigns on a scale unmatched in the Western Mediterranean, battles that shifted the momentum of the conflict and opened the path to Roman expansion beyond Sicily. By the early 250s BCE, the First Punic War had begun to outgrow its Sicilian origins. What had started as a series of localized sieges and regional maneuvers was rapidly evolving into a Mediterranean-wide contest for naval and strategic dominance. Rome's initial success at Mylae proved that the Republic could challenge Carthage at sea, but the years that followed would test that capability on an unprecedented scale. As both powers expanded their fleets, refined their tactics, and sought new avenues to break the stalemate in Sicily, the war shifted into a new phase defined by massive naval operations and ambitious campaigns far from either capital. The first of these wider engagements came at the Battle of Sulci, 258 BCE, fought off the western coast of Sardinia. While the specifics of the battle remain partly obscured by fragmentary sources, Polybius and later historians agree that Rome secured a significant victory, capturing or destroying a portion of the Carthaginian fleet stationed in the region. This success disrupted Carthaginian lines of communication between North Africa, Sardinia, and Sicily. It also gave Rome a broader strategic horizon. The Republic was now able to probe Carthaginian naval networks far beyond the central Sicilian theater. Tyndareus, 257 BCE, further demonstrated Rome's adaptation to naval warfare. The Roman commander, Gaius Atilius Regulus, encountered a Carthaginian fleet near the northeastern Sicilian coast. In the initial phase of the engagement, Regulus mistakenly advanced too far with a small vanguard of ships, exposing them to a Carthaginian counterattack. Yet once the main Roman line closed the distance, the corvus once again shaped the battle. Captured Carthaginian ships piled up, and despite the early Roman miscalculation, the engagement ended favorably for Rome. Tyndareus confirmed that even when Roman seamanship faltered, Roman infantry, delivered via the corvus, remained a decisive asset. But these engagements were only precursors to the monumental clash at Ecnomus, 256 BCE, widely considered one of the largest naval battles in ancient history. Estimates suggest that between 600 and 700 warships participated, carrying perhaps 250,000 men in total. The scale alone underscores how dramatically the conflict had escalated. Rome and Carthage both recognized that control of the sea would determine whether the war would remain confined to Sicily or expand into a decisive confrontation elsewhere. The Roman fleet, commanded by the consuls Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso, adopted a distinctive wedge-shaped formation. Two squadrons formed the forward point of the wedge, while a third covered the rear and guarded the transport ships carrying the invasion force destined for North Africa. Carthage responded with a more traditional, broad-front naval formation designed to envelop the Roman wings and sever the wedge's point from its supply-laden rear. The battle unfolded as three simultaneous engagements. At the center, the Roman wedge pushed directly into the Carthaginian line, using the corvus to negate enemy maneuvering and break up the front ranks. On the flanks, Carthaginian squadrons attempted to circle and trap the Roman transports, but the Roman reserve squadron countered these moves, preventing a collapse of the formation. Despite significant losses on both sides, the Romans achieved a strategic victory. The Carthaginian fleet was driven off, and the route to Africa was open. In the aftermath of Ecnomus, the Roman consuls launched the first major amphibious expedition of the war. Landing near Cape Bon, they established a fortified camp, securing a foothold in Carthaginian territory. Early operations were promising. Regulus won initial victories against Carthaginian field armies and succeeded in destabilizing the countryside. Roman forces sacked surrounding towns, disrupted agricultural production, and even threatened the Carthaginian heartland near Tunis. Emboldened by these successes, the Senate ordered Vulso to return to Italy with part of the fleet, leaving Regulus with a more modest force to continue the campaign. Carthage, facing one of the gravest threats in its history, embarked on a sweeping military reorganization. The most decisive step was the recruitment of the Spartan mercenary commander Xanthippus. Unlike Carthage's previous generals, Xanthippus understood how to counter a Roman army in open terrain. He restructured Carthage's forces, integrating large numbers of cavalry and emphasizing the tactical strengths of North African war elephants. Whereas Roman commanders had often tried to avoid pitched battles against elephants, Xanthippus built his entire strategy around them, using their shock value to shatter Roman lines. In 255 BCE, the two armies met near Tunis. Xanthippus deployed his troops with calculated precision. Elephants formed the vanguard, infantry occupied the center, and cavalry massed on the wings. When the battle commenced, the elephants drove deep wedges into the Roman formation, sowing confusion and breaking cohesion. Carthaginian cavalry overwhelmed the Roman flanks, completing the encirclement. Regulus's army collapsed under the combined pressure. Most of the Roman infantry was killed or captured. Regulus himself was taken prisoner. Only a fraction of the force escaped toward the coast. Rome attempted a rescue operation, but the returning fleet was struck by a catastrophic storm, losing hundreds of ships. Although Rome would eventually rebuild and return to the offensive, the African expedition demonstrated both the heights of Roman ambition and the limits of their early naval dominance. The war had now shifted decisively into a prolonged, multi-theater struggle, one that neither side could resolve quickly. The African campaign marked a point of inflection. Carthage had shown that it, too, could adapt, often with devastating effectiveness. Rome had demonstrated both extraordinary capacity and profound vulnerability. The next years of the war would see intensified operations on land and sea, as both powers sought a path to final victory in an increasingly expansive and brutal conflict. After the failure of the African expedition and the catastrophic storm losses that followed, the First Punic War entered a markedly different phase. Large-scale invasions gave way to prolonged sieges, defensive consolidation, and intermittent maneuver campaigns across Sicily's rugged interior. Both powers recognized that decisive breakthroughs were increasingly unlikely and turned instead to strategies aimed at attrition. Rome sought to pressure Carthaginian strongholds and sever their supply networks, while Carthage focused on maintaining fortified positions and recruiting new mercenary forces to offset earlier defeats. This period, stretching from the late 250s to the late 240s BCE, became defined by incremental gains, logistical hardships, and the growing realization that neither side could easily dislodge the other. Sicily's geography played a central role in shaping this stalemate. The island's major fortified towns, particularly Lilybaeum, Drepanum, and Panormus, anchored Carthaginian positions along the western coastline. Rome's attempts to penetrate these defensive networks required sustained sieges, yet the Republic's forces were continually challenged by supply constraints and the difficulty of maintaining siege works over uneven terrain. Archaeological surveys at several Sicilian sites reveal remnants of Roman entrenchments, including rampart lines and the remains of ditches used to isolate enemy positions. These findings confirm that Roman siegecraft was deployed extensively, even when results were limited. Carthage responded by reinforcing its strongholds and expanding its reliance on mercenary labor. The Carthaginian command recruited Libyan, Iberian, and Gallic contingents, many of whom were redirected to Sicily to defend strategic ports. Classical sources note the diversity of these troops, and their presence is supported by distinctive weapon deposits discovered near western Sicilian sites, including Iberian-style falcata blades and North African javelin points. Carthage's commitment to mercenary armies reflected both logistical necessity and institutional preference. Maintaining fortified positions required a constant supply of manpower that the city's own population could not provide. The Roman Senate, aware that Sicilian operations were dragging into a multi-year endeavor, attempted to regain the initiative through renewed offensives. One objective was the strategic town of Lilybaeum, which controlled access to western Sicily and served as a primary Carthaginian naval base. In 250 BCE, Rome mounted a large-scale siege, deploying battering rams, siege towers, and a blockade intended to cut off maritime resupply. Polybius describes the extensive engineering efforts undertaken, including the construction of moles designed to restrict access to the harbor. However, Carthaginian ships repeatedly outmaneuvered the Roman blockade, using skilled pilots familiar with the narrow harbor channels. The failure at Lilybaeum highlighted the limitations of Roman naval and siege capabilities when confronted with strong Carthaginian resistance. Despite the Republic's extensive manpower resources, the siege dragged on without decisive progress. Carthaginian commanders, including Hamilco and later Adherbal, successfully maintained supply lines by executing nighttime blockade runs. Archaeological evidence from the harbor area, particularly anchor deposits and ship fragments, suggests repeated naval activity consistent with the ancient accounts. These findings support the conclusion that Carthage retained operational flexibility even under Roman pressure. Elsewhere in Sicily, both sides engaged in maneuver warfare aimed at disrupting supply networks and securing minor towns. Roman forces captured certain inland settlements, but Carthage retained control of key coastal strongholds, which provided access to naval reinforcement. These minor victories and losses rarely altered the strategic balance. The war, once defined by sweeping campaigns, now revolved around incremental territorial adjustments that neither side could transform into decisive advantage. Compounding the difficulties of this period were a series of destructive storms that struck Roman fleets attempting to support Sicilian operations. The loss of hundreds of ships in multiple incidents severely weakened Rome's ability to maintain naval superiority. Polybius emphasizes the cumulative effect of these disasters, suggesting that natural forces eroded Rome's strategic momentum more effectively than Carthaginian counterattacks. Shipwreck debris discovered along the southern Sicilian coastline confirms that severe weather events contributed to fleet losses during this phase of the war. Carthage, for its part, also struggled with prolonged logistical burdens. Maintaining fortified positions over many years required continuous resource inflows from North Africa and Sardinia. Supply shortages occasionally strained relations between Carthaginian commanders and their mercenary forces, leading to localized unrest. However, Carthage's experience in managing long-distance trade networks provided some mitigation, ensuring that its principal strongholds remained operational. By the late 240s BCE, the stalemate had become apparent to both sides. Rome maintained a significant land presence in Sicily but lacked the naval capacity to secure decisive victories. Carthage held essential coastal bases yet could not expel Roman forces from the island's interior. The conflict had crystallized into a contest of endurance, with each power waiting for an opportunity to shift the balance. Despite years of stalemate, both sides prepared for a renewed naval confrontation in the final decade of the First Punic War. Rome made a deliberate strategic decision that would determine the fate of the conflict. It would rebuild its fleet from the ground up. After years of catastrophic storm losses and the destruction of earlier naval squadrons, the Senate initially hesitated to allocate further state funds. According to Polybius, This impasse was resolved when prominent Roman citizens contributed private capital to finance a new fleet, reflecting the Republic's unique capacity to mobilize resources beyond formal state mechanisms. The resulting naval construction program marked the beginning of the war's final phase, during which Rome sought to break the long-standing stalemate in Sicily by regaining control of the sea. The new fleet was designed with lessons from earlier campaigns in mind. Roman shipwrights focused on producing lighter, more maneuverable quinquiremes, deliberately avoiding the heavy structural reinforcements required for the corvus boarding device. Having recognized that the corvus contributed to instability during storms, Roman commanders opted for tactics emphasizing seamanship and naval maneuver rather than relying on boarding as the primary means of engagement. This shift brought Roman naval practice closer to established Carthaginian methods, reducing the technological disparity that had once favored Carthage. Reconstructions based on ancient descriptions suggest that these new vessels had improved hull profiles and more efficient rowing arrangements, helping compensate for Rome's relative inexperience at sea. Carthage, meanwhile, faced increasing difficulties in maintaining its Sicilian positions. Years of fighting had strained financial reserves, and the reliance on mercenary forces made sustained mobilization costly. By the late 240s BCE, the Carthaginian command was focused on resupplying its remaining strongholds, particularly those at Lilybaeum and Drepanum. Polybius indicates that the Carthaginian fleet assembled for resupply operations was inadequately prepared compared to earlier periods of the war, reflecting both resource shortages and the cumulative effects of prolonged conflict. Archaeological surveys of Carthaginian coinage during this period show debasement patterns, highlighting economic pressures that likely undermined naval readiness. Rome's fleet, placed under the command of Consul Gaius Lutatius Catullus, sailed to Sicily in 242 BCE and set up operations near the Aegates Islands, a strategic position along Carthage's primary route for transporting supplies from Africa. Catullus implemented rigorous training regimens for his crews, focusing on rowing synchronization, rapid turning maneuvers, and coordinated squadron movement. These practices aimed to compensate for Rome's historically limited maritime experience and to prepare the fleet for a decisive confrontation. Polybius emphasizes that Catullus personally oversaw these preparations, indicating the level of Roman commitment to achieving naval superiority. Carthage prepared a major resupply convoy in early 241 BCE, commanded by Hanno. The fleet was heavily burdened with supplies, ammunition, and additional troops intended to reinforce the Sicilian garrisons. This logistical load reduced maneuverability and limited the crew's capacity to engage in sustained combat. Carthaginian ships also carried crews that were reportedly less experienced than those earlier in the war, as many seasoned seamen had been lost in previous engagements or diverted to other responsibilities. These conditions set the stage for a decisive encounter. The Battle of the Aegates Islands on March 10, 241 BCE, unfolded as the culmination of these asymmetrical preparations. Catullus positioned his fleet to intercept the approaching Carthaginian convoy as it neared the islands, taking advantage of favorable winds and sea conditions. Roman ships, now lighter and more adaptable, maneuvered into forward positions to disrupt the Carthaginian formation. Without the corvus, Roman crews relied on ramming tactics supported by disciplined coordination among rowers and officers. Polybius describes the battle as heavily influenced by the respective states of the fleets. Rome was fully prepared for combat, while Carthage was hindered by the logistical burden of its supply mission. The Carthaginian fleet attempted to form defensive lines, but the weight and configuration of their ships made rapid adjustments difficult. Roman vessels exploited these weaknesses, striking vulnerable points and breaking the cohesion of Carthage's formation. Archaeological evidence, including ram fragments and shipwreck studies from the Mediterranean basin, indicates that ramming engagements during this period involved coordinated strikes aimed at destabilizing enemy hulls rather than simply breaching them. Rome's tactical improvements allowed its crews to execute such maneuvers effectively. As the battle progressed, Carthaginian resistance faltered. Losses increased rapidly, and many of the surviving ships attempted to retreat. Catullus' forces secured a clear victory, capturing or destroying a significant portion of the Carthaginian fleet. This defeat made it impossible for Carthage to maintain or reinforce its positions in Sicily, effectively severing its final operational link to the island. The loss at the Aegates Islands thus represented not only a tactical setback but also the collapse of Carthage's strategic capacity to continue the war. The outcome forced Carthage to sue for peace. With its fleet incapacitated, the city could no longer sustain its Sicilian holdings or challenge Rome's renewed maritime dominance. Roman control of the sea allowed for uninterrupted supply operations, ensuring the continued presence of Roman forces on the island. The Senate leveraged this advantage in diplomatic negotiations, establishing terms that significantly weakened Carthaginian influence in the western Mediterranean. With Carthage defeated at sea, diplomatic negotiations reshaped the balance of power. The conclusion of the First Punic War was formalized in 241 BCE with the Treaty of Lutatius, which codified the terms imposed on Carthage following its naval defeat at the Aegates Islands. According to Polybius, the treaty required Carthage to evacuate all holdings in Sicily, effectively ceding the island to Rome. Additionally, Carthage agreed to pay a substantial indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver, to be delivered over a decade. The treaty also curtailed Carthage's capacity to rebuild its navy, limiting the city's ability to project power independently across the western Mediterranean. These terms were unprecedented in their combination of territorial loss, economic burden, and strategic restriction, marking a decisive shift in Mediterranean balance toward Roman ascendancy. For Carthage, the treaty produced immediate and long-term repercussions. The financial strain imposed by the indemnity placed heavy pressure on the state's treasury, requiring accelerated taxation and intensified exploitation of North African resources. Mercenary forces, accustomed to high pay during wartime, became increasingly restless as funds became scarce. Contemporary accounts and inscriptions suggest that unpaid troops staged mutinies or threatened revolt in several garrisons, creating a chain of crises that undermined central authority. The political institutions of Carthage, particularly the Sephites and the Council of 104, faced challenges in managing these internal stresses while maintaining cohesion among the mercenary armies and civilian population. The loss of Sicily also had strategic and psychological consequences. Sicily had served not only as a source of revenue but also as a forward operational base for Carthaginian influence in the central Mediterranean. Its forfeiture diminished Carthage's ability to control maritime trade routes and to project military power toward Italy, Sardinia, and southern Gaul. In addition, the reduction of naval autonomy constrained Carthage's flexibility in responding to both internal and external threats, forcing a recalibration of long-term defense strategies and economic planning. Rome, in contrast, gained both material and institutional advantages from the treaty. Sicily became the Republic's first overseas province, initiating a model of territorial administration that included garrison placement, taxation, and integration of local communities into Roman political and economic systems. Archaeological studies of Roman settlements in western Sicily indicate early infrastructure development, including roads, granaries, and fortified posts, reflecting systematic administrative planning. The acquisition also provided Rome with a reliable source of agricultural revenue, particularly grain, which would support both population growth and future military campaigns. The broader consequences of the post-war settlement extended beyond immediate territorial and fiscal effects. Carthage's political system faced increasing internal pressure as traditional elite structures struggled to reconcile the demands of state financing, mercenary obligations, and the need for defensive preparedness. Historians note that the inability to manage these stresses effectively laid the groundwork for the Mercenary War, 240 to 237 BCE, a conflict that threatened to destabilize the Carthaginian state completely. The combination of unpaid troops, political factionalism, and economic strain created a volatile environment in which the survival of the regime was uncertain. For Rome, the post-war environment presented both opportunity and precedent. Successfully administering Sicily provided experience in governing foreign territories, collecting tribute and projecting authority beyond the Italian peninsula. The mechanisms developed during this period would form the foundation for future provincial governance in Hispania, Gaul, and North Africa. Moreover, Rome's success in transforming a wartime victory into lasting political control demonstrated the Republic's capacity for strategic consolidation, setting a model that would shape its expansion over the next 2 centuries. The Treaty of Lutatius, therefore, represents more than a simple peace settlement. It codified a transfer of strategic initiative, imposed structural challenges on Carthage, and initiated the Roman practice of overseas provincial management. The combination of financial, military, and territorial pressures on Carthage, alongside Rome's newly acquired administrative capabilities, created conditions that would reverberate throughout the Western Mediterranean. These dynamics not only stabilized Roman dominance in Sicily, but also generated the internal conflicts and external pressures that presaged the Mercenary War and the eventual resumption of hostilities in the Second Punic War. In the years after 241 BCE, Carthage faced a severe internal conflict that nearly destroyed the state. Within months of the First Punic War's conclusion, Carthage faced a crisis that threatened to undo decades of state-building and military accomplishment. The indemnity imposed by Rome, coupled with the enormous expenses of prolonged campaigns in Sicily, left the Carthaginian treasury depleted. In an effort to stabilize finances, the government attempted to reduce payments owed to its mercenary forces, a decision that proved catastrophic. These troops, drawn from Libya, Iberia, Gaul, and other regions of the Western Mediterranean, had been instrumental in Carthage's wartime operations, but their loyalty was contingent on remuneration. Polybius recounts that when the government hesitated or reneged on agreements, mercenaries refused to disband, demanding full payment and threatening revolt. The escalation from a financial dispute to full-scale rebellion occurred rapidly. Initial mutinies in key garrison towns spread as communication between forces enabled coordination and the formation of a quasi-independent coalition. Libyan settlements in the hinterland joined the insurrection, providing both manpower and access to critical supply routes. Archaeological evidence, including burned granaries and disrupted urban layouts in sites such as Leptis Minor and Thapsus, supports historical accounts of widespread destruction during this period. The revolt was not merely a localized mutiny, but a structural crisis that undermined Carthage's territorial authority across its North African holdings. As the conflict intensified, the truceless war earned its name from the extraordinary brutality employed by both sides. Negotiation attempts failed repeatedly, and acts of violence escalated to extreme measures. Captured enemies were executed en masse, settlements that resisted mercenary occupation were razed, and prisoner exchanges were abandoned entirely. Polybius emphasizes the psychological as well as strategic dimensions of this brutality, noting that fear and retaliatory violence became central instruments of control. The internal instability extended to Carthage itself, where the city faced direct siege by segments of the rebelling forces, threatening the very survival of the government and its elite institutions. The revolt persisted for several years, from 241 to 237 BCE, placing enormous strain on Carthage's political and military apparatus. Governing councils and Sephites struggled to coordinate loyalist forces while negotiating with mercenaries whose demands were both diverse and shifting. Reliance on traditional citizen levies was insufficient, requiring Carthage to seek new alliances and to redeploy veteran troops from the periphery of the state. Polybius notes the strategic innovation that arose from necessity, including targeted relief operations, tactical feints, and the concentration of forces to relieve besieged urban centers. The eventual resolution of the Mercenary War relied heavily on the emergence of competent and assertive leadership. Hamilcar Barca, appointed to command loyalist forces, implemented a systematic campaign to isolate, engage, and neutralize rebel contingents. Drawing on his experience from previous Sicilian campaigns, Hamilcar combined disciplined infantry formations, cavalry mobility, and calculated use of mercenary auxiliaries loyal to Carthage. His leadership restored coherence to a fractured military structure, allowing the government to regain control over critical towns and trade routes. Hamilcar's approach also emphasized strategic restraint and incremental consolidation. Instead of attempting large-scale assaults on the entirety of rebel-held territory simultaneously, he focused on containing the most dangerous contingents, relieving sieges of loyalist settlements, and progressively eroding the cohesion of the mutinous forces. By leveraging both military skill and knowledge of the region, he effectively re-established Carthage's dominance, culminating in the final suppression of the revolt by 237 BCE. Inscriptions and later classical accounts suggest that Hamilcar's campaigns were marked by both ruthlessness toward rebel forces and pragmatism in the preservation of critical infrastructure, ensuring that Carthage's post-war recovery could proceed. The mercenary war demonstrated the fragility of Carthage's post-First Punic War position. Structural vulnerabilities, financial strain, reliance on diverse mercenary forces, and a dispersed territorial network combined to produce a near collapse. Yet the conflict also facilitated the rise of a military and political figure who would profoundly influence Carthage's future. Hamilcar Barca's success in restoring order not only stabilized the state but also laid the groundwork for the Barcid dynasty's subsequent expansionist ambitions in Iberia. Through this crisis, Carthage emerged with lessons in both internal governance and military organization that directly shaped the strategic calculations leading to the Second Punic War. The conflict's resolution produced a new military leader whose influence reshaped Carthage's strategic future. Hamilcar Barca emerged from the mercenary war as the central figure in Carthage's political and military recovery. Tasked with suppressing a widespread and multi-ethnic rebellion, he demonstrated a combination of tactical ingenuity and disciplined command that restored Carthaginian authority over North Africa. Polybius emphasizes Hamilcar's ability to coordinate disparate loyalist forces, including citizen troops and mercenary contingents that had remained faithful to Carthage. By employing careful maneuver strategies in the African interior, taking advantage of terrain, controlling key supply lines, and isolating rebel factions, Hamilcar systematically reduced the operational capacity of insurgent forces while minimizing unnecessary losses among his own ranks. Hamilcar's approach was both methodical and adaptive. He avoided direct confrontation when conditions were unfavorable, instead using deception, feints, and the calculated application of force to compel surrenders. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Thapsus and Leptis Minor suggests widespread restoration and fortification projects following the revolt, indicating that Hamilcar integrated military success with the reconstruction of essential infrastructure. This approach not only secured immediate victory but also reinforced Carthage's long-term control over its North African heartland. Beyond the battlefield, Hamilcar consolidated political influence within Carthage's aristocratic councils. By demonstrating decisive leadership in a period of crisis, he strengthened the position of the Barcid faction, which emphasized disciplined command, strategic foresight, and loyalty to familial leadership. Inscriptions and numismatic evidence from the post-war period reflect the increasing prominence of Hamilcar and his allies, suggesting that military achievement translated directly into political capital. The Barcids' rising authority shaped Carthaginian decision-making, particularly in matters of resource allocation, military appointments, and foreign policy. The suppression of the revolt also allowed Carthage to reassert control over rebellious towns and territories in the hinterland. Hamilcar implemented measures to integrate these areas into the state's administrative and economic networks, ensuring that the lessons of the mercenary war, particularly the dangers of mercenary dependence and local unrest, were mitigated in future operations. Settlements were reinforced, taxation and tribute systems re-established, and garrisons strategically positioned to prevent recurrence of large-scale insurrections. Hamilcar's victory had broader strategic implications beyond North Africa. With the mercenary war concluded, Carthage possessed both a reorganized military and a renewed capacity for territorial expansion. Hamilcar leveraged this position to secure resources, recruit disciplined forces, and explore opportunities for economic growth beyond the immediate region. His leadership effectively set the stage for the Barcid expansion into Iberia, where Carthage would establish new bases of operation, exploit mineral wealth, and develop a mercenary recruitment infrastructure that would support future campaigns against Rome. The consolidation of Barcid authority also marked a shift in Carthaginian strategic culture. Hamilcar's emphasis on long-term planning, decisive military action, and centralized leadership contrasted with earlier approaches that relied heavily on fragmented councils and reactive measures. This transition enhanced Carthage's ability to project power beyond the North African core and positioned the Barcid family as architects of a new phase in Mediterranean geopolitics. Hamilcar Barca's leadership ended the revolt and positioned his family at the center of Carthage's strategic decision-making. Following the stabilization of Carthage after the Mercenary War, Hamilcar Barca turned his attention to Iberia, initiating a systematic program of territorial expansion that would secure the resources and strategic depth necessary for Carthage's recovery. Beginning in 237 BCE, Hamilcar led campaigns along the southeastern coast, establishing military outposts and forging alliances with local Iberian tribes. His approach combined diplomacy with military coercion, ensuring that conquered or allied communities contributed troops, resources, and loyalty to the Barcid cause. Classical sources, including Polybius, highlight Hamilcar's ability to integrate diverse tribal groups into a coherent operational structure, a practice that became a hallmark of Barcid administration. A central focus of the Iberian strategy was the development of Carthago Nova, founded around 228 BCE, which served as both a political and economic hub. Situated on the southeastern coast, the city provided a secure harbor for Carthaginian naval operations and a base for administrative governance. Archaeological excavations reveal sophisticated urban planning, including fortifications, residential districts, and infrastructural facilities designed to support both civilian and military populations. Carthago Nova became a center for the collection of tribute, the storage of resources, and the coordination of campaigns, reflecting the Barcid's emphasis on integrating territorial control with economic exploitation. The mineral wealth of Iberia was another critical factor in Carthage's resurgence. Hamilcar and his successors systematically exploited silver, gold, and iron mines, using the revenue to rebuild the Carthaginian treasury depleted by the First Punic War and the Mercenary War. Archaeological evidence, including mining shafts, smelting sites, and coinage bearing Punic inscriptions, demonstrates the scale and sophistication of these operations. These resources financed the recruitment and maintenance of mercenary armies, the construction of fortifications, and the expansion of naval capabilities, creating a self-sustaining power base capable of supporting large-scale military campaigns. Following Hamilcar's death in 229 BCE, leadership passed to his son-in-law Hasdrubal, who continued the Barcid strategy with a focus on consolidating control over the interior and northern territories. Hasdrubal extended Carthaginian influence through negotiated alliances, often formalized via oaths of loyalty and tribute agreements with Iberian chieftains. By integrating local leaders into Carthage's administrative system, Hasdrubal ensured a stable chain of authority, reducing the likelihood of rebellion and enabling systematic resource extraction. Punic material culture, including inscriptions, pottery, and coinage, reflects the spread of Carthaginian administrative practices across newly acquired territories. In 226 BCE, the Treaty of the Ebro between Hasdrubal and Rome established a formal boundary limiting Carthaginian expansion north of the Ebro River. The treaty, intended to prevent direct conflict between the two powers, effectively recognized Carthaginian control over southeastern Iberia while constraining northern ambitions. Polybius and later Roman sources emphasize the strategic significance of this boundary. It allowed Carthage to consolidate and develop its Iberian base without immediate interference from Rome, while Rome gained assurances regarding its allies in the northern Iberian corridor. The treaty exemplifies Barcid pragmatism, combining military conquest with diplomatic negotiation to secure sustainable territorial control. The Barcid family also fostered a new generation of military leadership, most notably Hannibal Barca, whose early experiences in Iberia provided training in command, logistics, and strategy. Hannibal's exposure to the operational and political complexities of Iberian governance, alongside the integration of mercenary forces and tribal allies, laid the foundation for his later campaigns against Rome. The systematic approach to territorial consolidation, combining urban planning, resource management, military organization, and diplomacy, illustrates the sophistication of Barcid governance and the durability of the Carthaginian Iberian Empire. By 218 BCE, Carthage had established a stable and prosperous base in Iberia capable of supporting extensive military campaigns and sustaining the state's economic needs. Archaeological surveys confirm the scale of urban development, fortification, and resource extraction, highlighting the deliberate planning behind Barcid expansion. The consolidation of Iberia restored Carthage's financial and strategic capabilities, transforming it from a post-war recovery state into a formidable power with the ability to challenge Rome once more. Rome viewed Barcid consolidation with increasing suspicion, especially as tensions converged around the city of Saguntum. The Second Punic War began not with open battle between Rome and Carthage, but with a sequence of diplomatic failures centered on the city of Saguntum. Situated in southeastern Iberia, Saguntum maintained a delicate balance of allegiance, historically interacting with both Rome and Carthage. While officially outside direct Carthaginian control, the city had treaties and trade agreements linking it to Rome, which increasingly interpreted any Barcid activity in the region as a violation of the 226 BCE Treaty of the Ebro. Polybius emphasizes that tensions escalated when Hannibal, acting under Carthaginian authority, laid siege to Saguntum in 219 BCE, a decisive assertion of Barcid influence that challenged Roman expectations of territorial limits. The siege itself showcased Hannibal's strategic acumen and operational planning. Literary accounts describe protracted operations involving systematic encirclement, siege engines, and coordinated assaults, while archaeological surveys of Saguntum's fortifications suggest sophisticated defensive structures, including towers, ramparts, and bastions capable of withstanding prolonged attack. Hannibal's forces, composed of both Carthaginian regulars and Iberian auxiliaries, adapted to the city's resistance, implementing measures to prevent supplies and reinforcements from reaching defenders. Evidence of destroyed gates and collapsed walls corroborates classical descriptions of progressive breaches, indicating the effectiveness of Carthaginian siegecraft. Rome's response to the crisis was delayed, influenced in part by military commitments in Illyria and logistical considerations for Mediterranean mobilization. Senate deliberations, preserved in Polybius, reveal an oscillation between diplomatic protest and cautious preparation for war. Envoys were dispatched to Carthage demanding Hannibal's withdrawal, yet the Barcid commander remained steadfast. This diplomatic exchange illustrates a critical point. Both powers operated under differing interpretations of prior treaties and the legitimacy of territorial influence, with Rome emphasizing formal alliances and Carthage prioritizing strategic expansion and control over Iberian territories. The fall of Saguntum in late 219 BCE effectively ended any prospect of a negotiated settlement. Hannibal's decisive actions not only eliminated the immediate obstacle to Carthaginian authority in southeastern Iberia, but also provided a strategic foothold for future campaigns across the Pyrenees and into Gaul. Polybius records that the city's destruction and population displacement sent a clear signal to Rome. Carthage under the Barcids would assert its interests proactively, regardless of Roman expectations or objections. Archaeological studies support the scale of devastation, including evidence of burned structures, collapsed fortifications, and mass graves, aligning with historical accounts of the city's resistance and ultimate surrender. The diplomatic breakdown following Saguntum illustrates broader systemic dynamics between Rome and Carthage. Both states viewed treaties and spheres of influence through lenses shaped by prior conflicts. Rome interpreted Barcid actions as treaty violations and direct threats to allied cities, while Carthage regarded its Iberian expansion as a necessary recovery and consolidation of resources following the First Punic War and the Mercenary War. The inability to reconcile these perspectives through negotiation underscores the structural tension inherent in overlapping territorial ambitions and strategic imperatives. By early 218 BCE, with the siege concluded and diplomatic channels exhausted, Rome formally declared Carthage guilty of aggression. The decision was underpinned by a strategic assessment of long-term security. Roman leadership concluded that allowing Hannibal to retain control over Iberian resources and military capabilities posed an unacceptable risk to Italian territories and allied communities. The Senate's formal mobilization orders included the preparation of legions, coordination with allied Italian states, and logistical arrangements for campaigns north of the Alps, anticipating Hannibal's eventual advance into the Italian peninsula. The episode at Saguntum thus represents more than a local military operation. It was the flashpoint that transformed two regional powers into adversaries engaged in a prolonged and systemic conflict. It demonstrates the interaction of territorial strategy, diplomatic interpretation, and military capability, highlighting how Hannibal's calculated actions forced Rome to confront Carthage militarily. The siege set the strategic stage for Hannibal's subsequent campaign, illustrating his ability to integrate operational objectives with broader geopolitical consequences. With diplomacy exhausted, Hannibal initiated one of the most ambitious military campaigns in ancient history. Hannibal's campaign into Italy began with meticulous logistical planning in Carthago Nova, the Barcid stronghold in southeastern Iberia. By 218 BCE, he had assembled a diverse army composed of seasoned Carthaginian troops, Iberian infantry, Numidian cavalry, and war elephants. Polybius emphasizes that this force represented not only a military instrument but a mobile political statement, intended to project Carthaginian power across the western Mediterranean and to gain the allegiance of local populations, particularly the Gallic tribes of northern Italy. Hannibal's strategy required the careful coordination of supplies, maintenance of troop cohesion, and anticipation of environmental obstacles over a march spanning hundreds of miles. The initial phase of the march involved movement across Iberian territories to the Pyrenees. Hannibal negotiated with local tribes, balancing coercion and diplomacy to secure safe passage, and occasionally engaging hostile contingents to maintain order. Archaeological evidence, including Iberian fortifications and temporary encampments, corroborates the use of systematic encampment sites and controlled river crossings to manage both troops and animals. The Pyrenees presented the first significant natural obstacle, requiring engineers to construct makeshift bridges and clear paths through narrow passes, ensuring that elephants and wagons could traverse the difficult terrain without fragmenting the army. Upon reaching the Rhone River, Hannibal faced the challenge of a wide and fast-flowing waterway. Classical sources, particularly Polybius and Livy, describe the use of pontoons, rafts, and temporary bridges to transport troops and animals efficiently. Modern geographical reconstructions support these accounts, demonstrating that Hannibal likely employed a combination of river engineering techniques, careful reconnaissance, and controlled fording to cross without significant attrition. The crossing also involved engagement with local Gallic groups, some hostile and some allied, underscoring the dual military and diplomatic components of Hannibal's operational planning. The march through Gaul toward the Alps was marked by continuous negotiation and occasional skirmishes with tribal populations. Hannibal's logistical system included prepositioned supply caches and the requisition of local resources, enabling the army to maintain momentum despite the absence of established roads. Topographical analysis indicates that the army moved through valleys and passes that allowed the largest elements, including elephants, to progress while minimizing exposure to ambush. The coordination of multiple columns and the maintenance of discipline over this heterogeneous force illustrate a level of operational sophistication unprecedented in the Western Mediterranean. The Alpine crossing represents the most debated and remarkable aspect of Hannibal's overland advance. Classical sources describe both the extreme difficulty of the terrain and the severe attrition suffered by troops and animals. Modern scholarship has proposed several potential routes, with current consensus favoring the Col de la Traversette as the primary passage, although alternative hypotheses suggest the Little St. Bernard or Col du Mont Cenis. Environmental analysis, including geomorphological studies and dendrochronological data, supports the notion that Hannibal faced deep snow, narrow paths, and the threat of rockslides, requiring innovative solutions such as breaking trees into ramps and using local guides. The successful passage of elephants, cavalry, and infantry under these conditions demonstrates remarkable logistical acumen and troop discipline. Throughout the Alpine campaign, Hannibal's strategic objective extended beyond mere territorial movement. By moving through Gaul and into Cisalpine regions, he aimed to secure alliances with local Gallic tribes disaffected with Rome. These diplomatic overtures were often reinforced with the display of military capability and the provision of gifts or protection, integrating political objectives into the operational framework. Polybius notes that Hannibal's treatment of allied tribes, respectful and reciprocal, contrasted sharply with punitive measures applied to hostile populations, enhancing Carthaginian influence and facilitating the army's passage. Hannibal's march also involved careful attention to timing and seasonal conditions. He aimed to enter Italy before the onset of winter, enabling engagement with Roman-aligned settlements and maximizing the psychological impact of his approach. Coordination of scouting parties, foraging units, and rear guards minimized losses and maintained the cohesion of a force composed of multiple ethnic contingents with distinct military traditions. Archaeological surveys of Alpine passes revealed traces consistent with temporary encampments and defensive earthworks, supporting the classical narrative of an organized and disciplined Transalpine movement. By the time Hannibal emerged into Cisalpine Gaul, the army had already demonstrated operational mobility and strategic foresight that would define the early years of the Second Punic War. The combination of tactical engineering, logistical management, diplomacy, and topographical adaptation allowed Hannibal to preserve combat effectiveness and position his forces to challenge Rome directly. The march itself became a foundational element of Carthaginian strategic doctrine and exemplifies the Barcid emphasis on integrated military and political planning. Hannibal's overland march demonstrated a level of strategic planning unprecedented in the Western Mediterranean. Upon entering Italy, Hannibal immediately pursued engagements to destabilize Rome's alliances. Hannibal's early campaigns in Italy were defined by a series of rapid and decisive engagements that exploited both Roman organizational weaknesses and the advantages of coalition warfare. The first encounter, the Battle of the Ticinus in late 218 BCE, was primarily a cavalry engagement along the banks of the Ticinus River in Cisalpine Gaul. Polybius and Livy described the use of Numidian light cavalry to harass and probe the Roman forces commanded by Publius Cornelius Scipio. Terrain played a crucial role, with riverbanks and narrow approaches constraining Roman maneuverability. Archaeological surveys of the area indicate evidence of temporary encampments and fortifications, supporting the historical record of careful positioning and the strategic use of river crossings. Hannibal's personal leadership during this engagement demonstrated his capacity to coordinate mixed forces, integrating Iberian and Gallic cavalry with Carthaginian command structures to achieve localized tactical superiority. Following Ticinus, Hannibal engaged the Romans at the Trebia River in December 218 BCE. This battle marked the first large-scale confrontation of the war, combining infantry, cavalry, and war elephants in coordinated operations. Hannibal exploited the winter conditions and river geography, inducing the Romans under consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus to advance prematurely across the frigid Trebia. Polybius notes that Hannibal concealed a portion of his infantry in nearby woodlands, executing a double envelopment once the Roman forces were fully committed. The Roman legions suffered significant casualties and morale losses, while Hannibal's forces remained cohesive. Battlefield archaeology and geomorphological studies suggest that the positioning of ambushing forces in wooded terrain was feasible and consistent with ancient descriptions, highlighting the Carthaginian commander's integration of environmental conditions into operational planning. The psychological and strategic impact of the Trebia engagement extended beyond immediate losses. The defeat forced Rome to reconsider consular deployments and demonstrated that Hannibal could challenge the traditional superiority of Roman legions. Roman political institutions responded by mobilizing additional manpower, reinforcing allied contingents, and adjusting military strategy, but these measures were reactive and lacked the anticipatory insight displayed by Hannibal. The coordination between Hannibal's diverse forces, Numidian cavalry, Iberian infantry, Gallic allies, and war elephants, revealed an operational flexibility that Rome had yet to replicate. In 217 BCE, Hannibal executed one of the most audacious tactical maneuvers of the war at the Battle of Lake Trasimene. Utilizing careful reconnaissance and intimate knowledge of the local terrain, Hannibal orchestrated a large-scale ambush along the narrow defile between the lake and surrounding hills. Roman forces under consul Gaius Flaminius were drawn into the trap as they advanced along constrained roads with limited flank security. Contemporary accounts and modern topographical analysis indicate that the combination of fog, wooded hills, and limited visibility allowed Hannibal to achieve surprise, encircling the Romans and inflicting catastrophic casualties. Lake Trasimene demonstrated not only tactical brilliance but also the strategic advantage of integrating environmental intelligence, local guides, and coordinated troop dispositions into operational planning. The cumulative effect of these early battles was a profound erosion of Rome's strategic stability. The consular command system, designed for annual leadership rotation and shared authority, was exposed as vulnerable to Hannibal's rapid maneuvers and unconventional tactics. Political pressures increased as news of defeats reached Rome, compelling the Senate to enact emergency levies, reorganize legions, and secure loyalty among Italian allies. Hannibal's ability to combine psychological impact with tactical innovation destabilized the broader Roman coalition, encouraging defections among Gallic and other Italic tribes. Polybius emphasizes that these engagements were as much battles of perception and alliance management as they were of arms. Hannibal's coalition tactics were a critical factor in these victories. By integrating multi-ethnic contingents with differing combat traditions, he created complementary units capable of operating in varied terrain and under complex command arrangements. Iberian infantry, skilled in open-field maneuvers, Gallic cavalry, effective in flanking, and Numidian horsemen, adept at skirmishing, were all coordinated to exploit specific vulnerabilities in Roman formations. This operational cohesion, combined with Hannibal's personal leadership, enabled him to achieve decisive outcomes even when facing numerically comparable or superior Roman forces. The early defeats also forced Rome to innovate in terms of strategic adaptation. Subsequent campaigns would increasingly rely on Fabian strategies, avoiding pitched battles and focusing on attrition, fortified positions, and harassment of Carthaginian supply lines. These responses highlight the long-term significance of Hannibal's opening victories, which reshaped Roman military doctrine and emphasized the importance of flexibility, intelligence, and operational coordination in the face of unconventional opponents. Hannibal's opening victories revealed the vulnerabilities in Rome's consular command system. These early victories set the stage for one of the most consequential battles in Roman military history, Cannae. The Battle of Cannae, fought in August 216 BCE, represents a pinnacle of Hannibal's tactical ingenuity and the most catastrophic defeat for Rome during the Second Punic War. Facing a Roman consular army reportedly numbering between 80,000 and 90,000 men, Hannibal's force of approximately 50,000 combined troops, including Iberian infantry, Gallic levies, Numidian cavalry, and war elephants, executed a carefully planned engagement that maximized his strengths while exploiting Roman weaknesses. Polybius and Livy provide detailed accounts of the battle's progression, and modern military simulations have confirmed the feasibility of Hannibal's double envelopment maneuver under the terrain and force conditions described in classical sources. Hannibal arranged his troops with the center composed of weaker Iberian and Gallic infantry, deliberately allowing it to yield under the Roman advance. Flanking these central units, he positioned his strongest infantry and cavalry contingents, including heavy Gallic and Numidian horsemen, to envelop the Roman forces as they pressed forward. Environmental factors, including the hot August sun, intermittent winds, and the dusty Apulian plain, exacerbated Roman disorganization while benefiting Hannibal's flexible formations. Battlefield archaeology, including the study of soil disturbances and topographical surveys, corroborates descriptions of open plains flanked by limited elevations, which facilitated the envelopment without providing the Romans significant avenues for retreat. The Roman command structure at Cannae, divided between consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, contributed to operational rigidity. Livy records that Varro, commanding on the day of battle, pressed for aggressive frontal engagement despite warnings from Aemilius and experienced officers. This overcommitment played directly into Hannibal's plan, as the Roman heavy infantry advanced into the center, gradually enveloped by the stronger flanking forces. Hannibal's cavalry, operating with superior mobility, decisively routed Roman cavalry on both wings and completed the encirclement by attacking the rear, leaving the Roman infantry trapped and systematically annihilated. Casualty estimates, while debated, indicate approximately 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers were killed, with thousands captured. Polybius emphasizes that Hannibal's losses were relatively light, numbering in the range of 6,000 to 8,000. The scale of Roman casualties created immediate political and social shock, prompting the Senate to implement emergency measures, including appointing dictators, raising fresh legions, and instituting the levy of additional manpower from allies. Despite the devastating defeat, Rome's political institutions and mobilization capacity allowed the state to recover and maintain operational continuity, a critical factor in the protracted nature of the Second Punic War. Hannibal's success at Cannae illustrates several key tactical principles: the effective use of mixed force composition, the integration of cavalry and infantry in coordinated maneuvers, and the exploitation of terrain and environmental conditions. By anticipating Roman tactical rigidity, Hannibal created a controlled trap that maximized his army's mobility and cohesion. Military historians often regard Cannae as a classical example of the double envelopment tactic, demonstrating how operational planning, discipline, and adaptability can overcome numerical inferiority. The immediate political consequences in Rome were profound. Allied communities began to question Roman protection, and several Italian cities defected to Hannibal's banner. However, the Senate's measured response, including refusal to negotiate peace and the strategic employment of Fabian tactics, prevented the complete collapse of Roman authority. Rome's ability to sustain multiple legions, levy additional troops, and maintain cohesion among remaining allies highlights the resilience of Roman political military structures even in the face of catastrophic battlefield defeat. The Battle of Cannae also had longer-term strategic implications. Hannibal's army, despite its tactical brilliance, lacked the logistical support and reinforcements necessary to convert battlefield victory into strategic conquest of the Italian peninsula. Roman adaptation, including the avoidance of direct engagement and the focus on attritional warfare, slowly eroded Hannibal's operational freedom while preserving Rome's overall strategic position. Analyses of command decisions, operational logistics, and subsequent troop deployments reveal that the battle, while a tactical masterpiece for Carthage, did not translate into immediate strategic victory. At Cannae, Rome suffered one of the most severe military defeats in its history. Despite the scale of the defeat, Rome adapted its strategy and avoided collapse. In the aftermath of Cannae, Rome faced an existential military crisis. The loss of tens of thousands of soldiers, coupled with defections among Italian allies, threatened the structural integrity of the Republic. Rather than seeking immediate battlefield confrontation, the Senate appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, tasking him with the preservation of Roman forces and the containment of Hannibal's operational freedom. Fabius, known later as Cunctator or the Delayer, implemented a strategy that prioritized attrition, reconnaissance, and harassment over direct engagement, fundamentally altering Roman conduct in the war. Fabius's approach centered on avoiding large-scale pitched battles, recognizing that Roman numerical superiority could not offset Hannibal's tactical brilliance. Instead, he utilized fortified camps, carefully monitored troop movements, and targeted Carthaginian foraging and supply operations. Ancient sources, including Livy, emphasized that Fabius sought to frustrate Hannibal's advances while minimizing exposure to ambush. Modern logistical reconstructions support the effectiveness of these measures, showing that disruption of supply lines and denial of resources would progressively degrade Hannibal's army over time without requiring direct combat. The Fabian strategy initially faced significant political and public resistance. Roman elites and consuls accused Fabius of timidity, arguing that avoidance allowed Hannibal to ravage Italian territories unchecked. Despite these criticisms, the Senate largely supported Fabius, balancing short-term political pressures with the long-term imperative of force preservation. This political calculus demonstrates the interplay between Roman institutional flexibility and strategic patience, highlighting a distinctive feature of republican governance: the ability to implement unconventional military doctrines despite societal expectations for immediate victory. Operationally, the Fabian strategy relied on constant mobility, intelligence gathering, and selective engagements. Cavalry units and light infantry were dispatched to monitor Hannibal's movements, while fortified positions along key passes and river crossings limited enemy maneuver options. Small-scale ambushes and harassment of foraging parties inflicted attrition without risking the destruction of Roman legions. Polybius notes that these measures gradually constrained Hannibal's operational flexibility, forcing him to disperse forces for resupply and limiting opportunities for decisive action in central Italy. Demographic and logistical analysis underscores why Rome could sustain this long-term strategy. The Republic's manpower pool, derived from citizen soldiers and allied contingents, enabled continuous levies and legion replenishment, even after catastrophic losses. In contrast, Carthage relied heavily on mercenary forces whose replacement and loyalty were contingent on financial resources and local recruitment. Supply line analysis further illustrates that Hannibal's forces operated increasingly at the end of extended lines of communication, reliant on foraging and temporary storage sites in hostile or semi-hostile territories. Fabius's strategy exploited these structural limitations, making prolonged survival and incremental attrition a feasible approach. Fabius also emphasized psychological and political stabilization. By preserving Roman forces, he prevented panic in allied communities and maintained the credibility of the Senate's authority. His avoidance strategy implicitly reinforced Roman resilience, signaling that defeat on the battlefield did not equate to the collapse of the Republic. Over time, this cautious approach enabled Rome to reorganize multiple legions, reinforce strategic positions, and cultivate intelligence networks across northern and central Italy, laying the groundwork for subsequent counteroffensives. The Fabian strategy exemplifies an operational philosophy that integrates political, logistical, and military considerations. By prioritizing endurance over immediate triumph, Fabius demonstrated an understanding of asymmetric warfare and resource management. His policies ensured that Rome could survive Hannibal's tactical brilliance while gradually preparing the Republic for a long-term, attritional campaign that leveraged Rome's superior manpower and territorial depth. Scholarly analysis of troop replacement rates, provisioning records, and campaign timing reinforces the strategic soundness of this approach, confirming that Rome's survival depended on systemic adaptation rather than battlefield heroics. Rome's survival depended not on immediate victory, but on endurance and systematic adaptation. As Rome stabilized in Italy, the war expanded to Spain, Sicily, and eventually Africa. Following the stabilization of Rome's position in Italy under the Fabian strategy, the Second Punic War increasingly shifted to peripheral theaters where both powers sought to gain strategic leverage. Spain emerged as a critical arena due to its wealth, manpower, and role as a staging ground for Carthaginian reinforcements to Hannibal. Early campaigns in the Iberian Peninsula, conducted by the elder Scipio brothers, Gnaeus and Publius, encountered fierce resistance from Carthaginian forces commanded by Hasdrubal Barca. These operations were complicated by difficult terrain, tribal alliances, and logistical challenges. Archaeological evidence from fortified settlements, mining sites, and battlefield locations supports textual accounts of sieges and troop movements, illustrating the complexity of conducting sustained campaigns in Spain. The deaths of both Scipio brothers in 211 BCE marked a severe setback for Roman operations. Despite these losses, Roman political institutions quickly reorganized command structures, demonstrating the Republic's capacity for rapid leadership replacement. Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, emerged as a key figure due to both his familial connections and demonstrated strategic insight. His appointment to command Roman forces in Spain was based on a combination of political support in the Senate and recognition of his operational competence. Scipio's initial campaigns focused on consolidating Roman alliances with local Iberian tribes, securing supply lines, and isolating Carthaginian strongholds, laying the foundation for systematic attrition of enemy resources. Concurrently, Sicily became a theater of both defensive and offensive operations. Roman forces under Marcus Claudius Marcellus advanced against Carthaginian garrisons and mercenary contingents, ultimately recapturing Syracuse in 212 BCE. The siege combined traditional Roman siegecraft with naval blockade operations, supported by archaeological evidence including siege ramps, fortifications, and recovered weaponry. Marcellus's campaigns demonstrated Rome's capacity to conduct simultaneous operations across multiple theaters, integrating naval and land forces while preventing Carthage from consolidating regional power bases. The Roman control of the western Mediterranean sea lanes played a decisive role in limiting Carthaginian strategic options. Naval dominance prevented large-scale reinforcement of Hannibal in Italy, forcing Carthage to rely on smaller, incremental shipments of troops and resources. Polybius and modern maritime analyses indicate that Roman interdiction of coastal supply routes constrained Hannibal's operational autonomy and magnified the effectiveness of the Fabian strategy. This systemic control of logistics illustrates how strategic maritime superiority complemented Rome's land-based defensive posture. Scipio's operations in Spain achieved critical successes, including the capture of Carthago Nova, a major administrative and economic center, and the disruption of Carthaginian access to silver mines and local allies. These victories not only restored Roman control over Iberian territories, but also provided a financial and manpower base to support further campaigns. The integration of local tribal forces into Roman operations demonstrated both tactical flexibility and political acumen, weakening Carthaginian influence and preparing the ground for an eventual offensive beyond the peninsula. The combined effect of campaigns in Spain and Sicily was a gradual shift in the war's center of gravity. While Hannibal maintained operational dominance in Italy, his inability to receive substantial reinforcements limited strategic options. Roman successes in peripheral theaters created new pressure points, forcing Carthage to divert attention and resources away from supporting the Italian front. The strategic coordination across Spain, Sicily, and maritime operations highlights Rome's evolving approach, integrating political, economic, and military objectives to achieve cumulative advantage over a dispersed and resource-constrained opponent. The expansion of operations also set the stage for a decisive strategic recalibration. By systematically weakening Carthaginian infrastructure, disrupting supply lines, and cultivating allied support, Rome positioned itself to shift the focus of the conflict toward the Carthaginian homeland. The emergence of Scipio Africanus as a capable commander exemplified Rome's ability to generate innovative leadership within its institutional framework, ensuring continuity in strategic planning despite earlier setbacks. As the Italian front reached equilibrium, the wider Mediterranean became the decisive arena of conflict. By 204 BCE, Rome prepared for a direct campaign against Carthage itself. Following decades of intermittent tension after the Second Punic War, Roman suspicion of Carthage intensified. Despite Carthage's formal compliance with the terms of the 201 BCE treaty, its recovery in trade, agriculture, and civic infrastructure alarmed Roman politicians. The Republic's expansionist mindset, combined with Carthage's proximity to Numidian incursions under Massinissa, created a persistent sense of threat. Massinissa, leveraging Roman support, conducted repeated raids into Carthaginian territory, pressuring the city-state economically and militarily. Polybius records that these incursions highlighted Carthage's vulnerability and amplified calls within Rome for preemptive action. Among the political hawks, Cato the Elder famously concluded every Senate speech with the refrain Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. This insistence reflected not only lingering resentment over the previous wars but also strategic calculation. Rome could not allow a prosperous, militarily competent neighbor so close to its North African holdings. The Senate debated various approaches, from diplomatic containment to direct military intervention. Roman envoys pressed Carthage to comply with increasingly punitive measures, culminating in the demand that the city abandon its coastal location and relocate at least 10 miles inland, effectively crippling its economic lifeline and maritime identity. Carthaginian leaders protested vigorously, emphasizing their treaty compliance and the impossibility of abandoning the city. Diplomatic correspondence and contemporary accounts show a mix of rational negotiation and coercion, with Rome leveraging both threats and moral imperatives to justify its demands. The Carthaginian response, seeking delay and compromise, only reinforced Roman perceptions of duplicity and resistance. These interactions illustrate a structural dynamic. Rome's political and military institutions increasingly framed Carthage as an existential risk rather than a treaty-compliant state. The Roman ultimatum was thus not solely a reaction to past conflicts but a preemptive assertion of strategic dominance. Economic revival, fortified defenses, and Carthage's ongoing mercantile operations were interpreted as potential catalysts for future military resurgence. The city's request for moderation and negotiation failed to sway a Senate determined to eliminate any possibility of renewed competition. Diplomatic channels, once viable, were effectively closed by the insistence of Roman hardliners. By 149 BCE, the diplomatic stage had hardened into a near-inevitable confrontation. Rome's ultimatum imposed conditions Carthage could not meet without self-destruction. The requirement to relocate inland threatened the city's commercial lifeblood, undermined civic cohesion, and violated centuries of established urban settlement. Polybius and later historians described the shock and outrage among Carthaginian citizens and magistrates, who recognized that compromise would yield both strategic and existential defeat. The ultimatum marked a critical moment in the structural progression toward war. Rome's combination of political insistence, support for Massinissa, and naval and military readiness created a situation in which Carthage's defensive options were severely constrained. The balance of power, previously moderated by treaties and Roman strategic caution, had tipped decisively. Carthage's negotiation attempts, while earnest, were interpreted as stalling tactics that justified preemptive action. Rome did not attack Carthage for what it had done, but for what Romans feared it might become again. The stage was set for a war Carthage could not escape. The Third Punic War began with cautious Roman advances, but early operations quickly revealed the resilience of Carthage's defenses. The city's fortifications, including massive stone walls, towers, and deep defensive ditches, allowed Carthaginian forces to repel initial Roman assaults. Carthage's citizens, motivated by the existential threat, organized militias, coordinated with remaining mercenary units, and utilized limited naval sorties to disrupt Roman supply lines. Archaeological evidence of destroyed fortifications and weapon remnants confirms the intensity of urban defense during these opening stages. Roman commanders initially struggled to achieve decisive results. Conventional siege tactics, reliant on battering rams, towers, and circumvallation, were hindered by Carthage's sophisticated defensive works and the defenders' tenacious use of the urban landscape. Attempts at direct assault repeatedly failed, producing high casualties and limited territorial gains. The prolonged stalemate generated political frustration in Rome, where impatience with the drawn-out campaign created pressure for leadership changes. In this context, Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, grandson of Scipio Africanus, was elected consul in an extraordinary display of political maneuvering, despite lacking the usual sequence of magistracies. His election reflected both recognition of his inherited military reputation and the Senate's urgency for competent leadership to conclude the siege. Upon taking command, Scipio Aemilianus immediately undertook a comprehensive reorganization of the Roman forces, emphasizing discipline, logistical coordination, and the integration of both infantry and siege engineering units. Polybius notes that he instituted rotational deployments to maintain continuous pressure while minimizing attritional losses among Roman troops. Under Scipio's direction, the Romans systematically tightened the encirclement of Carthage. Siegecraft techniques included the construction of earthworks and ramps to approach the walls, deployment of torsion-powered artillery to breach fortifications, and coordinated naval blockades that restricted Carthage's maritime movements. The Romans also established fortified camps around the city to prevent sorties, cutting off internal communication and resource access. Carthage, while resourceful in constructing counter-ramps and defensive barricades, faced increasingly constrained options as the Romans methodically reduced available maneuver space. Naval engagements, though limited by Carthage's weakened fleet, played a crucial role in controlling coastal supply routes. The Romans, leveraging both galleys and transport vessels, maintained a blockade that prevented reinforcement or escape. In response, Carthaginian sailors attempted sporadic sorties to disrupt the blockade and deliver essential supplies, but these efforts were insufficient against Roman numerical and tactical superiority. Archaeological finds, including shipwrecks and harbor fortifications, corroborate the historical accounts of contested maritime operations during the siege. Urban combat within Carthage's outer districts further demonstrated the intensity of resistance. Civilians and soldiers participated in defense, reinforcing walls, erecting barricades, and mounting counterattacks against Roman sappers. The interplay of siege engineering and street-level resistance prolonged the conflict, exemplifying the interplay between military technology, civic cohesion, and urban geography. Polybius emphasizes the determination of Carthage's population, noting that the defenders' efforts significantly delayed Roman progress and inflicted meaningful casualties on attacking forces. Scipio Aemilianus combined patience with targeted aggression, recognizing that attritional pressure, rather than reckless assault, would ultimately compel surrender. The Romans systematically dismantled outer fortifications while expanding controlled territory, forcing Carthaginian defenders inward and exacerbating shortages of food and weaponry. Continuous bombardment and the tightening of the siege lines weakened morale, gradually reducing the effectiveness of defensive sorties and diminishing the capacity for coordinated resistance. The campaign demonstrates the complexity of protracted siege warfare, where success depended not on a single engagement but on strategic planning, engineering, and operational endurance. Roman coordination of land and naval forces, combined with disciplined rotations and methodical siegecraft, exemplifies the Republic's capacity to integrate logistics, engineering, and combat strategy. The Carthaginian response illustrates how urban fortifications and motivated populations could temporarily counter superior external forces, though structural limitations eventually constrained the city's long-term resistance. The war ended not with a single battle, but with a slow tightening of iron around an ancient city. After 3 years, the siege reached its brutal climax in the spring of 146 BCE. Roman forces launched the final assault on Carthage. After years of encirclement and attrition, the city's fortifications were breached through concentrated artillery fire, sapping walls, and persistent infantry pressure. Polybius and Appian describe a systematic attack. Roman legions advanced district by district, facing desperate resistance from both trained defenders and civilian combatants. Street fighting was brutal, with each quarter contested fiercely, illustrating the collapse of conventional urban defenses under sustained siege operations. Archaeological evidence, including charred building remains and mass graves, corroborates the scale and intensity of the fighting. The Romans advanced methodically, capturing outer districts before pressing into the city center. Fires consumed residential and commercial buildings, fueled by combat, deliberate arson, and structural collapse. The destruction extended to religious and civic structures, including Punic temples and sanctuaries. Contemporary accounts emphasize the symbolic dimension of this destruction: the eradication of civic identity, civic pride, and institutional memory. While later Roman sources suggest the salting of the earth to prevent future habitation, modern scholarship considers this likely rhetorical exaggeration rather than historical fact. Nonetheless, the systematic demolition of fortifications, civic buildings, and harbor facilities ensured Carthage could not recover as a political or economic entity. Massacres of combatants and civilians followed the capture of districts. Polybius reports that tens of thousands were killed or enslaved, with survivors sold into captivity across the Roman Republic. This mass enslavement served both to eliminate potential resistance and to supply labor for Roman territories. Archaeological excavations of burial pits, combined with textual accounts, confirm extensive loss of life and the dislocation of the city's population. The psychological impact of these actions reinforced Roman authority in North Africa and served as a deterrent to other states considering resistance to Roman expansion. Carthage's maritime infrastructure was systematically dismantled. Ports, docks, and shipyards were destroyed, depriving the region of its historic capacity for trade and naval construction. This ensured Rome's complete control of western Mediterranean sea lanes and removed any possibility of Carthaginian resurgence as a naval power. Economic networks that had sustained Carthage for centuries, including access to Sicily, Sardinia, and Iberia, were severed, illustrating the strategic dimension of the city's obliteration. The fall of Carthage marked the end of one of the Mediterranean's oldest civilizations. From Phoenician settlement to a dominant maritime empire, Carthage had exercised influence for nearly 7 centuries. Its destruction was total, both physically and institutionally, leaving the territory directly under Roman control. Yet the legacy of Carthaginian culture persisted indirectly through urban planning techniques, trade practices, and linguistic influences absorbed by surrounding populations. In the aftermath, Rome established the province of Africa, integrating former Carthaginian territories into its administrative and military framework. The elimination of Carthage as a competitor allowed Rome to consolidate hegemony in the Western Mediterranean, opening the path for further campaigns in the Hellenistic East. This transition illustrates the structural consequences of military victory. Political, economic, and cultural transformation accompanied territorial acquisition, redefining the regional order. The fall of Carthage demonstrates the culmination of prolonged strategic pressure, disciplined military execution, and political determination. Roman forces combined siegecraft, attritional tactics, and urban assault to achieve total victory. Carthage's attempts at resistance, while heroic, were ultimately constrained by prior strategic setbacks, demographic limitations, and Rome's overwhelming operational coordination. In the spring of 146 BCE, one of the Mediterranean's oldest civilizations burned. What emerged afterward was not simply victory, but transformation. With the obliteration of Carthage, Rome assumed undisputed dominance over the Western Mediterranean. The former Carthaginian territories were reorganized into the province of Africa, administered directly by Roman magistrates and subject to taxation designed to fund the Republic's ongoing military and civic projects. Roman officials implemented land redistribution, granting estates to veterans and Roman elites, while maintaining control over urban centers to regulate trade and resource extraction. Archaeological surveys of North African settlements reveal the integration of Roman infrastructure, including roads, aqueducts, and administrative buildings, signaling a deliberate effort to consolidate authority and impose Roman civic order. The conquest allowed Rome to secure key agricultural regions, particularly fertile grain-producing areas, which became crucial for feeding an expanding urban population in Italy and supporting future military campaigns. Maritime routes formerly controlled by Carthage were now under Roman oversight, ensuring safe transport of goods from Sicily, Sardinia, and Hispania. The strategic monopoly on trade and naval movement reinforced Rome's economic and military preeminence, while diminishing the likelihood of regional rivals challenging Roman hegemony. The Roman provincial model established in Africa became a template for subsequent territorial acquisitions. Governance combined military oversight with local administrative structures, allowing Rome to project authority while minimizing direct intervention in day-to-day affairs. Taxation systems, civic obligations, and legal codes were gradually introduced, facilitating integration of newly conquered peoples into the broader republican framework. Epigraphic evidence from African towns documents the presence of Roman magistrates, public works, and military garrisons, highlighting the institutionalization of imperial control. Beyond administration, the destruction of Carthage had geopolitical repercussions. With the Western Mediterranean secured, Rome expanded influence into Spain, consolidating gains from the Second Punic War, and looked eastward toward the Hellenistic kingdoms. This shift marked the beginning of Roman engagement in broader Mediterranean politics, as envoys, treaties, and military campaigns extended Roman authority into Greece, Macedonia, and beyond. Strategically, control over North Africa and the Western Mediterranean provided Rome with both the resources and security necessary to project power further east, without fear of significant disruption in its rear territories. Economically, Rome's acquisition of former Carthaginian lands transformed patterns of wealth and landholding. Estates previously under Carthaginian elites were redistributed, generating new social hierarchies aligned with Roman interests. Urban centers were repurposed as administrative hubs, trade nodes, and military staging points. This integration fostered a circulation of goods, labor, and capital under Roman supervision, reinforcing the Republic's capacity to sustain prolonged military campaigns and civic expansion simultaneously. Culturally, the absorption of North African territories introduced Romans to Punic and indigenous influences, which would later be reflected in architecture, religious practice, and material culture. While Rome sought to eradicate Carthage as a political entity, Aspects of Carthaginian technology, agriculture, and urban planning were adapted to serve the Republic's purposes, illustrating the pragmatic incorporation of conquered knowledge. With Carthage gone, Rome stepped into a new role, master of the Mediterranean. Its political, economic, and military structures enabled the Republic to dominate regional affairs decisively. Transitioning from a city-state with overseas interests to a regional hegemon, Rome imposed a provincial order that combined direct control, economic integration, and strategic oversight. But Roman victory also reshaped Roman society itself, creating new expectations, opportunities, and pressures for both elites and common citizens. The conclusion of the Punic Wars brought an unprecedented influx of wealth, resources, and human capital into Rome, fundamentally transforming its social, economic, and military structures. Conquered territories yielded substantial treasure, agricultural production, and populations enslaved through war. These slaves were distributed to Roman elites and integrated into large estates, radically altering labor patterns and intensifying economic inequality. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that the concentration of wealth in the hands of senators and equestrians created disparities between urban and rural populations, with smallholders increasingly displaced by large latifundia. Returning veterans from decades of protracted conflict compounded social pressures. Many expected land grants or financial compensation in recognition of their service, but administrative limitations and political factionalism delayed redistribution. Discontent among the veteran class contributed to rising tensions within the Roman political sphere, where populist and conservative factions debated the appropriate response to economic distress and veterans' claims. Polybius and later Roman historians note that these issues fostered an environment of agitation, wherein political actors leveraged social unrest to consolidate power or advance reform agendas. Militarily, the Punic Wars reshaped the Roman army. Extended campaigns had required continuous mobilization, establishing practices of professionalized command, rotational deployment, and logistical coordination that became institutionalized in subsequent conflicts. The integration of allied Italian troops, now accustomed to long-term campaigning, expanded Rome's manpower pool and created a standing network of trained soldiers available for provincial and overseas operations. The wars also emphasized the strategic importance of naval power, prompting investment in fleets and the retention of maritime expertise that would inform Rome's Mediterranean dominance. Economically, the spoils of war accelerated Rome's imperial ambitions. North African provinces supplied grain to Rome, while Spanish mining operations provided silver to fund further campaigns. The redistribution of conquered resources enabled the Senate to finance military expeditions without overburdening the citizenry, reinforcing Roman capacity for sustained conflict. However, these gains also introduced moral and political anxieties. The concentration of wealth and reliance on enslaved labor prompted debates over traditional Roman virtues, civic duty, and the social consequences of empire. Culturally and psychologically, the Punic Wars left a lasting imprint on the Roman consciousness. The memory of Carthaginian resilience, Hannibal's audacity, and the existential threats faced during the Second Punic War created a narrative framework emphasizing vigilance, discipline, and the justification for preemptive action. Cato the Elder's persistent call for Carthage's destruction exemplified a political and moral ethos rooted in perceived security and the need to eradicate potential rivals. These experiences informed military doctrine, senatorial rhetoric, and public expectations for generations. Rome won the Punic Wars, but the triumph planted seeds of future turmoil. The combination of wealth, slaves, and veterans reshaped the social hierarchy. The military evolved into a more professional and strategic force, and moral, political, and economic tensions began to surface. These transformations laid the foundation for internal pressures that would influence Roman politics and society long after the Mediterranean powers had been reordered. The Punic memory would live far longer than the war itself. Even in defeat, Carthage refused to disappear. Although Rome sought to obliterate the city politically, militarily, and symbolically, the cultural and economic imprint of Carthage persisted across North Africa and the wider Mediterranean. Roman authorities systematically dismantled Carthaginian urban centers, destroyed fortifications, and redistributed land to veterans and Roman settlers. Public memory, reinforced by historians and political rhetoric, framed Carthage as a cautionary tale of a rival erased by Roman resolve. Archaeological layers indicate widespread demolition and abandonment in the immediate aftermath, supporting accounts of near-total physical destruction. Despite this, elements of Punic culture proved resilient. Survivors maintained linguistic, religious, and commercial practices that continued to shape local societies. Temples and religious customs were gradually adapted into syncretic forms, merging Punic deities with Roman or indigenous cults. Inscriptions from North African towns reveal the persistence of Punic names and civic institutions, demonstrating continuity in everyday life even under Roman oversight. Carthaginian expertise in trade, agriculture, and urban planning influenced Roman provincial administration, revealing a pragmatic incorporation of conquered knowledge into the imperial system. The establishment of Colonia Julia Carthago under Julius Caesar and later Augustus marked a formal revival of the city within the Roman framework. While fundamentally a Roman urban settlement, its location atop the historic Punic core reflected continuity of urban geography and economic function. Archaeological excavations reveal that Roman Carthage incorporated Punic architectural elements, port facilities, and street grids, illustrating the pragmatic adaptation of Carthaginian infrastructure. The revival enabled the city to become a central hub of Roman Africa, serving as a nexus for trade, governance, and culture in the Mediterranean. Carthage's legacy extended beyond urban reconstruction. Punic linguistic elements, maritime knowledge, and agricultural practices persisted in surrounding territories. Roman writers occasionally acknowledged these influences, noting the sophistication of North African commerce and the persistence of local cults. Trade networks that had flourished under Carthage were absorbed into Roman systems, facilitating the integration of North Africa into the Mediterranean economy. This continuity demonstrates that Carthage's eradication was never absolute. Its institutional and cultural foundations were durable enough to influence Roman practices for centuries. The Punic religious system also experienced adaptation rather than total eradication. Elements of Carthaginian ritual, particularly in sanctuaries outside the city proper, survived through syncretism with Roman and local beliefs. Archaeological evidence of tophets and votive inscriptions indicates that traditional Punic rites continued in modified forms, maintaining community cohesion and regional identity. These practices contributed to a layered cultural landscape in which Roman, Punic, and indigenous elements coexisted, shaping the social and spiritual life of North Africa under Roman rule. Even in defeat, Carthage's legacy persisted in ways both tangible and symbolic. Its urban infrastructure informed Roman colonial planning. Its economic networks were absorbed into imperial commerce, and its cultural practices continued to influence regional identity. The city's revival under Roman auspices demonstrates the enduring value of Carthage's strategic location and societal sophistication. The Punic Wars were over. Their memory, however, only grew. The narrative of the Punic Wars is overwhelmingly mediated through the perspectives of Roman and, to a lesser extent, Greek authors. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BCE, offers a relatively analytical account, emphasizing chronology, causation, and military detail, yet he wrote with a Roman audience and patronage in mind. Livy, writing centuries later, imbued his histories with moralizing commentary and dramatization, often elevating Roman virtues while portraying Carthaginian actors as exotic, duplicitous, or reckless. Appian and later writers similarly framed the wars in terms of Roman triumph, emphasizing narrative coherence and the inevitability of Rome's victory. As a result, the surviving textual corpus privileges Roman interpretations, shaping the conventional understanding of Hannibal, Carthage, and the geopolitical dynamics of the Western Mediterranean. This Roman-centric perspective generates specific interpretive biases. Hannibal is frequently depicted as a brilliant but ultimately doomed adversary, emphasizing the inevitability of Roman success. Carthaginian governance, society, and strategic reasoning are often presented through negative or simplistic lenses, reducing complex mercantile, political, and military systems to moral or cautionary tales. Exaggerations of casualties, wealth, and battlefield heroics, while partially corroborated by archaeological evidence, must be scrutinized carefully. Furthermore, the Punic voice is largely absent, leaving historians reliant on inference from material culture, inscriptions, and comparative analysis to reconstruct Carthage's perspective. Archaeology provides an essential corrective to textual bias. Excavations of Carthaginian sites such as Carthage, Utica, and Theros illuminate urban planning, trade networks, fortifications, and religious practices, offering concrete evidence of societal complexity often understated in Roman accounts. Numismatic studies and inscriptions reveal administrative sophistication, mercenary recruitment systems, and diplomatic practices that demonstrate Carthaginian agency. These material sources allow modern historians to contextualize Roman narratives, distinguishing between rhetorical embellishment and structural reality. Modern historiography emphasizes critical methodology, interrogating the sources while seeking to recover suppressed or marginalized perspectives. Scholars evaluate the chronology, cross-reference accounts, and integrate non-literary evidence to produce balanced reconstructions. Debates persist regarding specific events, such as Hannibal's Alpine crossing, casualty figures at Cannae, or the causes of Carthage's collapse. But consensus increasingly appreciates the structural, logistical, and political factors underpinning outcomes, rather than attributing success solely to Roman virtue or Hannibal's genius. The predominance of Roman narratives also shaped the transmission of Punic memory in subsequent centuries. Carthage became a symbol of existential threat, moral otherness, and the justification for preemptive warfare, influencing Roman cultural memory and political rhetoric long after the city's destruction. Understanding this propagandistic framing is essential to interpreting both ancient sources and the legacy of the Punic Wars in Roman thought, including literature, legal precedent, and imperial ideology. The Punic Wars survive in voices that belonged mostly to Rome. Their accounts are invaluable yet incomplete, colored by the agendas, moral frameworks, and cultural assumptions of their authors. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence offers a partial corrective, revealing the resilience, complexity, and strategic reasoning of Carthage. Modern historians have sought to recover the other side, integrating material culture, comparative analysis, and critical historiography to construct a more nuanced understanding of one of antiquity's most consequential conflicts. This dual approach illuminates both the events themselves and the ways in which memory, myth, and bias shape historical knowledge. Archaeological investigation has profoundly reshaped our understanding of Carthage, revealing dimensions of the city and its empire that survive independently of Roman narratives. Excavations in Tunisia, particularly at Bursa Hill and surrounding settlements, have uncovered urban layouts, harbor installations, and residential architecture that illustrate Carthaginian sophistication. The material record demonstrates a well-organized city with fortified defenses, sophisticated water management, and public spaces aligned with social and religious hierarchies. Surveys and remote sensing, including satellite imagery, have expanded knowledge of suburban and rural Carthaginian settlement patterns, providing context for agricultural production, trade logistics, and regional governance. One of the most contentious areas of study concerns the Tophits, funerary and ritual sites containing cremated remains of children. Earlier scholarship, heavily influenced by Roman moralizing, interpreted these as evidence of widespread child sacrifice. Modern archaeological methods, including osteological analysis, radiocarbon dating, and spatial studies, have nuanced this picture, suggesting that while ritual sacrifice may have occurred, many interments likely reflect complex funerary traditions rather than routine atrocity. This reinterpretation challenges long-standing assumptions and demonstrates the importance of material evidence in correcting historical bias. Epigraphic studies have further illuminated Carthaginian administration and economy. Punic inscriptions, bilingual texts, and coinage reveal bureaucratic sophistication, trade regulation, and diplomatic activity. Analysis of inscriptions across North Africa and Iberia highlights Carthage's integration of local communities, the negotiation of alliances with indigenous Berber polities, and the administration of mercenary forces. Economic studies combining archaeological and textual evidence suggest that Carthaginian wealth derived from diversified sources: maritime trade, agricultural estates, and Iberian mineral extraction. These findings underscore the city's adaptability and strategic vision, contrasting with Roman depictions of Carthage as solely mercantile or decadent. The integration of multiple cultural perspectives has enriched interpretations of Carthaginian society. Phoenician foundations, interactions with indigenous Berber communities, and engagement with Hellenistic Mediterranean networks reveal a complex web of cultural and economic exchange. This approach highlights Carthage as a dynamic actor navigating diverse political, geographic, and economic challenges, rather than as a static antagonist in Roman storytelling. Comparative studies with other Mediterranean polities allow scholars to situate Carthage within broader patterns of urbanism, imperial expansion, and cross-cultural interaction. Modern scholarship also employs interdisciplinary methods to reconstruct Carthage's strategic and military capabilities. Analysis of harbor remains, naval equipment, and fortification patterns provides insight into logistical organization and defensive priorities. Studies of urban and rural landscapes indicate the coordination required to sustain prolonged conflicts, mobilize mercenary armies, and maintain economic stability. Together, these findings support a more balanced view of Carthage as a capable, adaptive state whose destruction was not inevitable but contingent upon a combination of military, political, and economic pressures. Shovels, satellites, and inscriptions are revealing a Carthage Rome tried to erase. Archaeology and epigraphy recover the city's complexity, demonstrating advanced urban planning, sophisticated governance, and regional influence that persisted long after its fall. By integrating Phoenician, Berber, and Hellenistic perspectives, scholars reconstruct a more nuanced understanding of Carthage's economy, society, and military. Beyond academic debate, these studies also influence cultural memory, emphasizing Carthage's resilience and enduring imprint on the Mediterranean world. Beyond academia, the wars evolved into something larger, shaping not only Roman history but the broader narratives of empire, memory, and identity. The Punic Wars continue to resonate in modern cultural memory, shaping narratives far beyond academic discourse. In cinema, television, and historical fiction, the wars are frequently dramatized with Rome cast as disciplined and virtuous, while Hannibal emerges as a brilliant, almost mythic adversary, and Carthage assumes the role of a tragic, doomed civilization. Films and novels often emphasize dramatic elements: the crossing of the Alps, the ambush at Lake Trasimene, or the encirclement at Cannae, highlighting human heroism, tactical genius, and existential stakes. These representations, while compelling, selectively interpret historical sources, privileging narrative coherence and emotional impact over precise chronology or nuanced political context. Historical strategy games and interactive media also contribute to the Punic legacy, allowing participants to simulate campaigns, control armies, and experiment with alternate outcomes. Titles such as Total War, Rome, or tabletop reenactments frame Hannibal as a tactical prodigy, while the structural and logistical achievements of Carthage are often simplified for playability. These engagements reinforce popular perceptions of the wars as contests of military genius and moral character, embedding them in contemporary understandings of leadership, strategy, and cultural identity. In doing so, they shape collective memory, emphasizing certain events and figures while marginalizing others, such as the experiences of ordinary soldiers, civilians, or Carthaginian society at large. Nationalist and political discourse has also drawn on the Punic Wars. In various periods, Rome has been invoked as a symbol of civic virtue, discipline, and imperial destiny, whereas Carthage represents both the dangers of mercantile excess and the existential challenges posed by a rival power. Hannibal's figure has similarly been appropriated, in some contexts as a model of audacity and ingenuity, in others as a cautionary exemplar of hubris or defiance against order. These interpretations reflect broader cultural values projected onto historical events, illustrating how memory is continually constructed and reinterpreted across generations. Literary and artistic representations frequently dramatize the destruction of Carthage, emphasizing the final conflagration, the siege's brutality, and the city's symbolic erasure. While classical sources inspired these depictions, modern retellings often amplify moral and emotional dimensions, presenting Carthage as emblematic of resilience, tragedy, or victimhood. This emphasis reinforces enduring cultural themes: the inevitability of Roman supremacy, the genius of Hannibal, and the high stakes of Mediterranean geopolitics. In combining factual events with mythic narrative, these portrayals shape public understanding of the Punic Wars as both historical and symbolic phenomena. The cumulative effect of these media representations is a layered cultural memory in which history and myth coexist. Hannibal becomes more than a general. He becomes a symbol of strategic audacity and defiance. Rome embodies order, endurance, and statecraft. Carthage remains the cautionary tale of wealth, ambition, and vulnerability. While such narratives may simplify or dramatize reality, they ensure the Punic Wars remain accessible, compelling, and influential in shaping perceptions of ancient history. Hannibal became more than a general, he became a symbol. The Punic Wars, as mediated through cinema, literature, games, and political discourse, continue to inform modern imagination, public memory, and cultural identity. Their lessons, dramatized victories, and catastrophic defeats persist not only as historical knowledge, but as enduring symbols in the collective consciousness of the Mediterranean and beyond. End of documentary. If you've followed the rise and fall of Rome and Carthage across centuries of conflict, strategy, and resilience, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel to explore more deep, research-driven historical documentaries, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our next immersive journey into the civilizations that shaped the ancient world. Dive into history with us, chronologically precise, academically grounded, and visually compelling, and see how the past still resonates today.